Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make your local CVS look absolutely quaint. The wonderfully horrifying world of 19th century pharmacies, where you could literally buy human flesh as medicine. That's right, while you're complaining about waiting 20 minutes for your prescription, people were casually purchasing ground-up mummies and human fat like they were picking up aspirin. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you brave enough to learn about medical cannibalism before bed. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into the night's journey through the most disturbing aisles in pharmaceutical history. Let's start with the biggest misconception about 19th century medicine. Most people imagine Victorian pharmacies as charming apothecaries filled with harmless herbs and maybe some questionable tonics that tasted like licorice and regret. In reality, your neighborhood druggist was essentially running a combination: medical supply store, grave robbing operation, and what can only be described as a human delicatessen. This wasn't some quaint shop where a kindly old man mixed lavender and chamomile. It was a place where you could purchase genuine human skull powder, Egyptian mummy wrappings, and yes, actual human flesh, all with the same casual confidence we buy vitamins today. Think of it like a Whole Foods, except instead of overpriced organic kale, they were selling overpriced organic corpses. And the customers? They weren't horrified. They were repeat buyers with shopping lists that would make a serial killer blush. The 1800s was an era when medical science was basically an educated guessing game played with human lives as stakes. Europe and America weren't the sanitized, regulation-heavy societies we know today. They were places where anyone with enough confidence and a mortar and pestle could hang up a shingle and start prescribing remedies that were equal parts medicine and medieval torture. The medical establishment controlled what passed for healthcare, and the consequences of that control were both hilarious and horrifying, depending on whether you were the doctor or the patient. If you thought 19th century medicine was all about gentle herbal remedies and soothing bedside manner, think again. It was an era when the most popular treatments included bleeding patients until they fainted, feeding them mercury until their teeth fell out, and prescribing human body parts like they were vitamin supplements. Pharmacists weren't the friendly neighborhood health advisors we know today. They were essentially legal drug dealers who happened to stock their shelves with ground-up humans alongside the laudanum and cocaine dot. The pharmaceutical industry was completely unregulated, meaning anyone could claim anything cured everything, and people actually believed them. There were no FDA approvals, no clinical trials, no safety studies, just enthusiastic testimonials and the medical equivalent of "trust me, bro." Doctors prescribed remedies based on ancient texts, popular superstitions, and whatever sounded impressive enough to justify their fees. And pharmacists? They were happy to stock whatever sold, whether it was snake oil, actual snake parts, or pieces of long-dead Egyptians. The only thing scarier than being sick in the 19th century was going to get treatment for it. Meet Dr. Robert James, a perfectly respectable 18th century physician who became famous for creating Dr. James's powder, a fever remedy that was basically antimony mixed with enough phosphate of lime to make it marketable. But James wasn't content with simple mineral poisoning. He was a pioneer in what we might politely call creative ingredient sourcing. His most popular remedies included generous doses of human skull, carefully prepared from the heads of people who had died violent deaths, because apparently regular death skull wasn't potent enough. But here's where it gets delightfully absurd. James wasn't some back alley quack operating out of a wagon. He was a respected member of the Royal College of Physicians, a man who treated nobility and published legitimate medical papers. His skull powder wasn't sold in shadowy corners. It was available at the finest apothecaries in London, complete with certificates of authenticity, guaranteeing the skulls came from properly violent deaths. Customers would specifically request execution skull over accident skull, as if they were ordering wine and concerned about the vintage. The consequences were predictably ridiculous. James's powder became so popular that grave robbing became a legitimate side business for enterprising pharmacists. There were actual supply chains for human remains, with different body parts commanding different prices based on the perceived cause of death. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear about the thriving trade in Egyptian mummy parts, where entire ancient civilizations were literally ground up and sold as medicine to wealthy Europeans who thought eating dead pharaohs would make them immortal. The irony, of course, is that most of these mummies were actually freshly manufactured corpses wrapped in old cloth and aged in caves. This wasn't just about a few eccentric doctors with questionable ethics and even more questionable anatomical collections. The human flesh trade represented a fundamental problem with 19th century medicine. The complete absence of scientific method combined with unlimited public gullibility and zero regulatory oversight. Entire families would spend their life savings on remedies made from grave dirt and powdered criminals, believing they were investing in cutting-edge medical technology. The people affected weren't just the patients slowly poisoning themselves with human remains, though they were certainly suffering in creative ways. Grave robbers were risking imprisonment to supply the pharmaceutical trade. Poor families were selling their deceased relatives to apothecaries. Even the dead weren't safe from becoming consumer products. The whole system created a bizarre economy where human bodies were commodities. Medical treatment was essentially legalized cannibalism, and the sicker people got from their medicine the more exotic remedies they demanded. This mattered then, because it killed people in spectacular fashion while making others rich. It matters now because it shows exactly what happens when medical claims aren't regulated. Scientific evidence is optional, and consumer protection laws don't exist. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made people buy ground-up criminals as fever medicines still make people fall for modern medical scams. But Dr. James and his skull powder empire was just the beginning of the pharmaceutical flesh trade. The real money wasn't in local grave robbing. It was in the international mummy market, where entire ancient civilizations became raw materials for European medicine cabinets. The international mummy trade wasn't just some bizarre footnote in medical history. It was a full-scale industrial operation that turned ancient Egyptian civilization into Europe's most expensive medicine cabinet. Unlike the common assumption that mummy medicine was some fringe practice limited to a few eccentric collectors, this was mainstream healthcare for anyone who could afford it. We're talking about a trade so lucrative that it literally stripped mined Egypt's archaeological heritage and turned it into powder you could buy at your local apothecary. This developed because medieval Arabic physicians had written about a substance called mummia, a natural bitumen found in Persia that supposedly had miraculous healing properties. But here's where European medicine took a characteristically ridiculous turn. When traders couldn't find enough natural bitumen, they noticed that Egyptian mummies were also black and tar-like from the preservation process. Some genius entrepreneur made the logical leap that if mummia was good medicine, then actual mummies must be even better medicine. It's like confusing maple syrup with motor oil and deciding to put the motor oil on your pancakes because it's darker and therefore more potent. The European medical establishment embraced mummy medicine with the enthusiasm of a startup discovering a new market segment. Respected physicians began prescribing powdered mummy for everything from headaches to broken bones. Because if ancient Egyptians were smart enough to preserve bodies for thousands of years, Surely eating those bodies would transfer their wisdom and longevity to European patients. The logic was bulletproof if you ignored basic concepts like cause and effect, contamination, and the fundamental difference between preserving something and consuming it. What made this particularly absurd was the complete lack of quality control. There was no standardized mummy preparation, no regulation of which parts of the mummy went into which medicines, and definitely no expiration dates. Apothecaries were literally grinding up random pieces of ancient corpses and selling them based on whatever health claims sounded most convincing. It was like Amazon reviews for dead pharaohs, except the customers were ingesting the product, and the product had been dead for millennia. Take the case of Ambroise Paré, the famous 16th century French surgeon who was initially a true believer in mummy medicine until he actually witnessed how it was made. Paré had been prescribing powdered mummy to patients for years, convinced he was providing cutting-edge medical treatment. Then he visited an apothecary's workshop and discovered that Egyptian mummy was being manufactured in French basements using fresh corpses from local hospitals, mixed with pitch and left to rot in ovens until they achieved the proper mummy-like consistency. The revelation was both hilarious and horrifying. Paré realized he'd been essentially prescribing baked homeless people to his wealthy clients, who had been paying premium prices for what they believed were ancient Egyptian royalty. The apothecary explained the process with the casual confidence of someone describing a recipe. Take one recently deceased hospital patient. Stuff the body with aromatic herbs to mask the smell. Cover in pitch and asphalt. Then slow cook until properly desiccated. The finished product was indistinguishable from genuine Egyptian mummies, especially after being ground in the powder and mixed with wine. But the fake mummy trade was nothing compared to the real thing. European merchants were literally excavating Egyptian tombs on an industrial scale, shipping entire mummies back to European pharmacies where they were processed like livestock in a medieval slaughterhouse. One German merchant named Johann Michael Asprung became famous for importing mummies by the ton, selling them to apothecaries across Europe, who would then portion out the remains like they were distributing cuts of meat. The processing was wonderfully grim. Mummies would arrive at European pharmacies, still wrapped in their burial linens, complete with whatever jewelry and amulets the grave robbers hadn't already stolen. Apprentice pharmacists would unwrap the bodies, sort the remains by body part. Skull fragments commanded premium prices, while torso meat was considered economy grade, then grind everything into powder, using the same equipment they used for legitimate medicines. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers that European Christians were literally eating pagan corpses in the name of medical science. One particularly enterprising apothecary in London advertised different grades of mummy powder based on social class. Pharaoh-grade mummy cost significantly more than peasant-grade, despite the fact that most of the mummies being imported were middle-class bureaucrats and merchants, not royalty. Customers would specifically request mummy powder from someone who had died young and healthy, because obviously the medical benefits of consuming ancient corpses were directly related to the corpse's original fitness level. The most absurd case involved a French nobleman who became convinced that mummy medicine would only work if he knew the specific identity of the person he was eating. He commissioned agents in Egypt to find him the mummy of a particular pharaoh, complete with historical documentation proving authenticity. The agents, recognizing a lucrative mark when they saw one, provided him with an elaborate backstory for a randomly selected mummy, including fabricated hieroglyphic translations describing the pharaoh's legendary health and longevity. The nobleman paid a fortune for his personalized ancient Egyptian corpse, convinced he was consuming the remains of medical royalty. But it wasn't that simple, because the mummy trade created problems that nobody had anticipated when they decided eating ancient corpses was good medicine. The first major complication was supply and demand economics applied to grave robbing. As European demand for mummy medicine increased, Egyptian suppliers began running out of actual ancient mummies and started manufacturing fresh ones using recently deceased locals. This created a bizarre situation where European patients thought they were consuming 3,000-year-old pharaohs, but were actually eating Egyptian peasants who had died the previous week. The authentication problem became legendary in pharmaceutical circles. Apothecaries were paying premium prices for genuine Egyptian mummies, but had no reliable way to distinguish real ancient corpses from contemporary fakes. Enterprising forgers developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for aging fresh bodies, including specialized ovens for proper desiccation and chemical treatments to achieve the right color and texture. Some fake mummies were so convincing that they fooled experts for decades, meaning European medical patients were participating in an elaborate international fraud scheme without realizing it. Even more problematic was the complete lack of medical standardization. Different apothecaries prepared mummy powder using completely different methods. Some ground up entire bodies, bones and all. Others focused specifically on soft tissue. A few specialized in just skull fragments or finger bones. There was no consistency in dosage, preparation, or even which part of the mummy went into which type of medicine. Patients seeking treatment for the same condition might receive completely different mummy preparations from different pharmacies, making it impossible to determine whether any observed effects were due to the treatment or pure coincidence. The theological complications were equally entertaining. European Christians were essentially practicing medical cannibalism while simultaneously condemning other cultures for similar practices. Church authorities were forced to develop increasingly creative theological justifications for why consuming pagan corpses was acceptable if done for medical purposes. Some religious scholars argued that since the Egyptians were already dead and pagan, eating them didn't count as cannibalism. Others maintained that mummy medicine was acceptable because it was transforming evil pagan bodies into Christian healing, like a form of post-mortem religious conversion through digestion. The most ridiculous contradiction was that nobody could actually prove mummy medicine worked, but the placebo effect was so strong that patients insisted it did. Wealthy Europeans were paying fortunes for ancient corpse powder, experiencing mild improvements that were likely due to other factors, then crediting their recovery to eating dead Egyptians. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where expensive mummy medicine became associated with successful treatment, regardless of actual medical efficacy. The result was a pharmaceutical industry that operated more like organized grave robbing than legitimate healthcare. European apothecaries became unwitting participants in the systematic destruction of Egypt's archaeological heritage, as tomb after tomb was stripped of mummies to feed the medical market. Entire ancient burial grounds were excavated not by historians or archaeologists, but by merchants looking to supply European pharmacies with raw materials for their corpse-based remedies, whose effect extended far beyond the European patients, slowly poisoning themselves with ancient remains. Egyptian communities found their ancestral burial sites being systematically looted by mummy hunters working for European pharmaceutical companies. Local authorities were often bribed to look the other way, creating a culture of corruption that prioritized European medical demands over preserving Egyptian cultural heritage. The irony was that Egyptians, who had invented sophisticated preservation techniques to ensure eternal rest for their dead, were watching their ancestors being shipped overseas to be ground up and consumed by foreigners. How people responded varied dramatically based on their position in the mummy supply chain. European patients generally remained blissfully unaware of the ethical implications of their medicine, focusing instead on whether their expensive corpse powder was delivering the promised health benefits. Apothecaries developed increasingly elaborate marketing materials to justify their mummy products, including detailed explanations of Egyptian preservation techniques and claims about the superior health of ancient peoples. Institutional reactions were characteristically hypocritical. Medical schools began teaching courses on proper mummy preparation and dosage, treating ancient corpse consumption as legitimate pharmaceutical science. Government authorities, rather than regulating the trade, focused on ensuring proper customs duties were paid on imported mummies. The Church developed official positions on the theological acceptability of medical cannibalism, generally concluding that eating pagans was fine if it helped Christians feel better. The long-term implications were both tragic and ridiculous. Egypt lost an incalculable amount of archaeological heritage to European medicine cabinets, with entire royal burial complexes being reduced to pharmacy inventory. The precedent established that foreign cultural artifacts could be treated as commercial commodities if there was sufficient European demand, a principle that would later extend to other forms of cultural appropriation disguised as scientific advancement. Most importantly, the mummy trade demonstrated how easily medical authority could be used to justify practices that were obviously unethical to anyone with basic moral reasoning. Respected physicians were literally prescribing cannibalism to their patients and calling it cutting-edge medicine, while an entire industry developed around the systematic desecration of ancient burial sites for profit. Meanwhile, back in European pharmacies, the success of the mummy trade was inspiring apothecaries to explore other exotic sources of human-based medicine. If ancient Egyptian corpses could command premium prices, imagine what fresh European body parts might be worth, especially if they came from people who had died under particularly dramatic circumstances. The mummy business had proven that European customers would pay almost any price for medicine made from human remains, as long as the marketing was sophisticated enough and the source exotic enough to justify the cost. This created obvious opportunities for enterprising pharmacists willing to diversify their human flesh inventory beyond imported ancient corpses to include locally sourced fresh materials. The transition from importing dead Egyptians to harvesting fresh Europeans represented the natural evolution of the pharmaceutical flesh trade. Why rely on expensive international supply chains when local hospitals and execution grounds could provide steady streams of raw materials for ambitious apothecaries? The principles were identical. Take human remains, process them into powder or oil, then market them as premium medical treatments to customers who were too desperate or gullible to ask uncomfortable questions about ingredient sourcing. This shift toward domestic human flesh processing would prove even more lucrative than the mummy trade, because fresh body parts could be customized for specific medical conditions and marketed with claims about the donor's health, age, and cause of death. European apothecaries were about to discover that running a pharmacy could be combined with operating what was essentially a Conley boutique cannibalism service for discerning medical consumers. If the international mummy trade was like importing vintage wine from ancient civilizations, then the domestic fresh flesh market was like operating a farm-to-table restaurant, where the main course was recently executed criminals and hospital patients. This wasn't about exotic foreign corpses with mysterious powers. This was about creating a local supply chain for human body parts, complete with quality control standards, customer preferences, and what can only be described as artisanal cannibalism for the discerning medical consumer. The context for this new pharmaceutical frontier was purely practical economics combined with European innovation in finding new ways to be horrifying. Importing mummies from Egypt was expensive, time-consuming, and unreliable. Smart apothecaries realized they could source fresh human materials locally, market them as superior to ancient alternatives, and develop premium product lines based on the circumstances of death. Why settle for 3,000-year-old Egyptian peasants when you could offer last week's executed murderer? Guaranteed fresh and processed according to the latest pharmaceutical standards? This became important because it represented the democratization of medical cannibalism. Mummy powder was luxury medicine for wealthy customers who could afford imported ancient corpses. Fresh local flesh products could be produced at various price points, making human-based remedies accessible to middle-class patients who wanted to participate in cutting-edge medical treatments but couldn't afford premium Egyptian remains. It was like the difference between shopping at Whole Foods versus a regular grocery store, except instead of organic vegetables, they were selling organic criminals. The relevance extended beyond simple market expansion. Local flesh sourcing meant apothecaries could offer customized products based on specific customer requirements. Want medicine made from someone who died young and healthy? No problem. The local hospital had plenty of options. Prefer your human flesh to come from someone who lived a virtuous life? The monastery had connections with families selling recently deceased relatives. Looking for something with more dramatic flair? Execution grounds provided a steady supply of fresh materials with compelling backstories that could justify premium pricing. European apothecaries were essentially creating the world's first boutique cannibalism services, where customers could select their preferred type of human flesh based on personal medical needs and budget constraints. The innovation wasn't just in sourcing. It was in marketing human consumption as a sophisticated lifestyle choice for health-conscious consumers who demanded the finest in corpse-based pharmaceuticals. Consider the remarkable career of Thomas Willis, a 17th-century English physician who became legendary for his human skull preparation techniques. Willis wasn't content with generic skull powder. He developed a specialized product line based on different types of violent death, marketing them to customers as if he was running a boutique wine shop, except with human heads instead of vintages. Willis's most popular product was usnea, a moss-like substance that grew on skulls left exposed to the elements after execution. He claimed that this skull moss, harvested specifically from the heads of hanged criminals, contained concentrated life force that could cure epilepsy and other neurological conditions. The preparation process was wonderfully macabre. Willis would visit execution sites immediately after hangings, collect the heads, with official permission, of course, then suspend them in specially designed outdoor enclosures where they would slowly decompose under controlled conditions until the desired moss developed. But Willis's genius was in the marketing. He created detailed product catalogs describing the medical benefits of different execution methods. Heads from hanged criminals were good for nervous disorders. Skulls from beheaded traitors were excellent for blood diseases. Bodies drawn and quartered provided premium ingredients for multiple organ systems. Willis essentially turned capital punishment into a pharmaceutical supply chain, where the method of execution determined the medical application of the resulting corpse products. The key players in Willis's operation included executioners who were paid extra to preserve heads in good condition, monastery officials who provided blessing services for the corpse processing, and wealthy customers who would place advance orders for specific types of criminal remains. The drama came from competition between different apothecaries for access to the best execution sites, leading to bidding wars over fresh corpses and exclusive contracts with executioners who guaranteed first access to newly deceased criminals. Resolution was typically European. Willis became so successful that he established formal business relationships with courts and prisons, essentially creating the world's first vertically integrated cannibalism corporation. He controlled the entire supply chain from sentencing to consumption, ensuring quality control and consistent product availability for his growing customer base. Another fascinating case involved the German physician Johann Schrader, who pioneered the use of human fat as a premium medical ingredient. Schrader discovered that European customers would pay extraordinary prices for remedies made from the rendered fat of healthy young people, particularly if the fat came from individuals who had died sudden, dramatic deaths. This led to the development of what historians politely call adipose pharmaceuticals, medicine made from human body fat, processed using techniques borrowed from soap making and candle manufacturing. Schrader's business model was brilliant in its simplicity. He established partnerships with hospitals, monasteries, and morgues throughout Germany, paying premium prices for fresh corpses that met his quality standards. The bodies would be transported to his processing facilities, where teams of workers would render the fat using large-scale industrial equipment. The resulting human lard was then refined, purified, and packaged into various medical products, ranging from topical ointments to internal remedies. The broader significance of Schrader's operation was that it proved human flesh processing could be scaled up from artisanal craft to industrial manufacturing. His facilities employed dozens of workers, processed hundreds of bodies annually, and distributed products across multiple countries. This wasn't some small-scale apothecary operation. It was a multinational corporation built on systematic corpse processing, complete with quality control standards, product testing, and customer service departments. The human elements of these stories are simultaneously tragic and absurd. Willis's customers included respectable middle-class families who genuinely believed they were providing the best possible medical care for their children by feeding them moss grown on criminal skulls. Schrader's employees went to work each day rendering human fat with the same casual professionalism of modern factory workers, viewing corpse processing as legitimate skilled labor that required technical expertise and attention to detail. Most remarkably, both operations were completely legal and socially acceptable. Willis and Schrader weren't underground criminals. They were respected businessmen who paid taxes, employed workers, and contributed to their local economies. Their customers weren't participating in some secret cannibalism cult. They were following medical advice from licensed physicians who prescribe human flesh remedies with the same confidence modern doctors prescribe antibiotics. This wasn't isolated to a few entrepreneurial physicians with unusual business models. The pattern of local flesh sourcing spread across Europe like a medical franchise opportunity, with apothecaries in different cities developing their own specialized approaches to human body part processing and marketing. What emerged was essentially a continental network of cannibalism-based healthcare, where human remains moved through sophisticated distribution systems designed to match specific body parts with targeted medical applications. The patent explanation reveals how economic incentives drove innovation in corpse processing techniques. Once apothecaries discovered that customers would pay premium prices for human-based medicines, market forces naturally led to improved sourcing methods, better preservation techniques, and more sophisticated marketing strategies. Competition between different flesh merchants resulted in product differentiation, where apothecaries would specialize in particular types of human remains or develop signature preparation methods that distinguish their products from competitors. Why this pattern existed relates to fundamental gaps in 17th and 18th century medical knowledge combined with unlimited human gullibility and zero regulatory oversight. Physicians had no understanding of how medicine actually worked, so they relied on ancient texts, popular superstitions, and whatever sounded impressive enough to justify their fees. Customers had no way to verify medical claims, so they evaluated treatments based on cost, exotic ingredients, and social status associated with different remedies. The social, political, and economic factors that enabled this pattern included the complete absence of medical regulation, widespread acceptance of class-based healthcare where wealthy people deserved better medicine, and religious frameworks that dehumanize certain categories of people: criminals, pagans, the poor. 2. The point where consuming their bodies seemed morally acceptable. European legal systems actively facilitated the flesh trade by providing reliable supplies of executed criminals and establishing property rights over corpses that enabled commercial processing. Comparison to other time periods reveals that medical cannibalism wasn't unique to early modern Europe. Ancient civilizations had practiced various forms of therapeutic corpse consumption, and similar practices persisted in other cultures throughout the same historical period. What made European pharmaceutical cannibalism distinctive was its scale, sophistication, and integration with legitimate commercial and medical institutions. The pattern extended beyond simple corpse processing to include elaborate authentication systems, quality grading standards, and customer service practices that mirror modern retail operations. European flesh merchants developed brand recognition, customer loyalty programs, and product lines tailored to different market segments. They established international trade relationships, standardized pricing structures, and professional associations that regulated competition and maintained industry standards. Most importantly, the pattern demonstrates how quickly normal people can adapt to participating in obviously unethical practices when those practices are presented as sophisticated, beneficial, and socially acceptable. European customers weren't forced to buy human flesh medicine. They actively sought it out, recommended it to friends, and paid premium prices for what they believed were superior products. The same psychological mechanisms that made respectable citizens eager consumers of ground-up criminals still operate in modern contexts where people make purchasing decisions based on marketing claims rather than evidence. The effects were simultaneously profitable and catastrophic, depending on whether you were selling human flesh or being processed into pharmaceutical products. European apothecaries who embraced the domestic flesh trade experienced unprecedented business growth, with some operations expanding from single-shop enterprises to multi-city networks that employed hundreds of workers and generated enormous profits from corpse processing and distribution. Who benefited included the obvious suspects: apothecaries, physicians, executioners, morgue attendants, and various middlemen who facilitated the movement of human remains from death sites to processing facilities. But the beneficiary list also included unexpected participants, like monasteries that charged fees for blessing corpse processing operations, transportation companies that specialized in moving human cargo, and even some poor families who discovered they could supplement their income by selling deceased relatives to pharmaceutical companies, who suffered extended far beyond the patients slowly poisoning themselves with human flesh remedies. The corpse trade created perverse incentives throughout European society, where human death became a commercial opportunity rather than a source of grief or reflection. Families of executed criminals found themselves harassed by flesh merchants seeking to purchase their relatives' remains. Hospital patients discovered that agreeing to experimental treatments might result in their bodies being sold to apothecaries after death. The unintended consequences were both predictable and absurd. Competition for fresh corpses led to conflicts between different apothecaries, sometimes resulting in violence over access to execution sites or morgue facilities. The commercialization of death encouraged corruption among officials responsible for managing corpses, with executioners and morgue attendants accepting bribes to provide access to premium remains. Some entrepreneurs began operating what amounted to murder-for-hire services disguised as medical research, though these extreme cases were rare and generally prosecuted when discovered. How this shaped future developments can be traced through the gradual emergence of medical regulation and oversight, systems designed to prevent pharmaceutical companies from literally eating their customers. The flesh trade scandals contributed to growing demands for government regulation of medical practice, scientific testing of pharmaceutical claims, and ethical oversight of research involving human subjects. Modern parallels are uncomfortably obvious for anyone familiar with contemporary healthcare controversies involving unproven treatments, exploitative pricing for essential medicines, and the use of desperate patients as markets for experimental therapies. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made people buy ground-up criminals as medicine still make them susceptible to medical scams that promise miraculous cures through exotic or expensive treatments. The lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of regulatory oversight for medical claims, the dangers of treating healthcare as a pure market commodity, and the need for ethical frameworks that protect vulnerable populations from exploitation by medical entrepreneurs. The flesh trade demonstrates what happens when profit motives are allowed to operate without ethical constraints in healthcare contexts, creating systems where human suffering becomes a business opportunity rather than a problem to be solved. Most significantly, the impact reveals how social acceptance of obviously unethical practices can develop gradually through institutional legitimization, expert endorsement, and cultural normalization of what should be recognized as fundamentally wrong behavior. Yet even as the domestic flesh trade was establishing itself as a legitimate pharmaceutical industry across Europe, a new development was already threatening to revolutionize the entire human body parts market. The rise of specialized execution techniques designed specifically to preserve corpse quality for medical use was creating unprecedented opportunities for apothecaries willing to invest in what amounted to custom-ordered fresh human materials. The success of local flesh sourcing had proven that European customers would pay premium prices for human-based medicines, especially when those medicines came with compelling backstories about the source materials. This created obvious market opportunities for entrepreneurs willing to work directly with executioners and courts to ensure that capital punishment procedures were modified to maximize the pharmaceutical value of the resulting corpses. Traditional execution methods like hanging or beheading had been designed for public spectacle and quick death, not for preserving body parts in optimal condition for medical processing. But as the flesh trade became more sophisticated and profitable, executioners began receiving requests from apothecaries for specialized killing techniques that would maintain corpse quality while still satisfying legal requirements for capital punishment. This collaboration between legal authorities and pharmaceutical entrepreneurs represented the next evolution in medical cannibalism, where the entire criminal justice system was being modified to serve the needs of apothecaries seeking premium human ingredients. Courts were about to discover that scheduling executions could be coordinated with pharmaceutical supply chains, creating integrated systems where legal punishment directly supported medical commerce through the systematic processing of criminals into consumer products for health-conscious Europeans. By the mid-1600s, the pharmaceutical flesh trade had reached a breaking point that would have been hilarious if it weren't so genuinely disturbing. The collaboration between executioners and apothecaries had evolved from casual corpse sales into systematic modification of capital punishment procedures, specifically designed to maximize the medical value of executed criminals. Courts were scheduling executions based on pharmaceutical demand rather than judicial necessity, and executioners were essentially operating dual businesses as both agents of justice and suppliers of premium human ingredients. The description of tensions becomes clear when you realize that European legal systems were being redesigned around the commercial needs of cannibalistic medicine. Judges were receiving requests from apothecaries to delay executions until market conditions were favorable for fresh corpse sales. Executioners were demanding higher fees from pharmaceutical companies seeking access to premium execution sites. Some courts were even experimenting with execution techniques specifically designed to preserve body parts in optimal condition for medical processing, essentially turning capital punishment into a form of pharmaceutical manufacturing. Key players involved included corrupt judges who accepted bribes to schedule executions according to apothecary requests, executioners who had developed specialized killing techniques for different types of medical applications, pharmaceutical entrepreneurs who were essentially operating murder-for-hire services disguised as legitimate medical businesses, and government officials who were struggling to maintain some semblance of legal legitimacy while profiting from the systematic commercialization of state-sanctioned killing. The stakes involved weren't just the obvious corruption of judicial systems and the transformation of capital punishment into commercial enterprise. The flesh trade had created a situation where innocent people were being executed specifically to supply pharmaceutical demand, where criminals were being kept alive or killed based on market conditions rather than legal requirements, and where entire communities were being terrorized by entrepreneurs seeking fresh sources of human materials for their medical businesses. What made this crisis particularly absurd was that nobody seemed to recognize the obvious ethical problems with organizing society around the systematic killing and consumption of human beings for profit. Courts treated execution scheduling as a legitimate business concern. Physicians prescribed human flesh remedies with the same professional confidence they used for any other medical treatment. Customers purchased ground-up criminals as casually as they bought any other consumer product. The entire system had normalized cannibalistic commerce to the point where participating in organized murder for profit seemed like rational economic behavior rather than obviously sociopathic criminal enterprise. The breaking point came in 1665 during what historians now call the Württemberg execution scandal, though contemporary sources politely referred to it as a pharmaceutical supply chain optimization controversy. The incident began when Duke Eberhard III of Württemberg entered into an exclusive contract with a consortium of apothecaries led by Dr. Johann Baptist van Helmont, a Flemish physician who had pioneered techniques for processing human organs into specialized medical remedies. The build-up to the crisis had been developing for months as Van Helmont's pharmaceutical operation expanded beyond traditional corpse sourcing into what amounted to custom-ordered human materials. His customers were paying extraordinary prices for medicines made from people who had died under specific circumstances. Young criminals executed for crimes of passion commanded premium prices for heart-related remedies, while intellectuals executed for heresy were processed into brain-enhancing tonics. The demand had grown so sophisticated that Van Helmont needed reliable supplies of carefully categorized human materials, which led him to approach Duke Eberhard with a business proposal that would revolutionize both capital punishment and pharmaceutical manufacturing. The key moments of the scandal unfolded when Van Helmont presented the Duke with a detailed contract proposing to modernize Württemberg's execution procedures in exchange for exclusive access to all executed criminals. The agreement included specifications for different killing methods designed to preserve specific organs in optimal condition for medical processing. Hanging would be reserved for criminals whose necks were needed for throat remedies. Beheading would be used when brain material was required for neurological treatments. A newly invented technique involving slow strangulation would preserve heart tissue for cardiac medications. But the truly scandalous element was Van Helmont's proposal to modify the judicial system itself to ensure steady supplies of pharmaceutical raw materials. The contract included provisions for expediting death sentences for criminals whose physical characteristics matched current medical demand, delaying executions when market conditions were unfavorable for corpse sales, and even commissioning executions of specific types of criminals based on advance orders from wealthy customers seeking customized human flesh remedies. Duke Eberhard who was apparently more entrepreneur than ethical leader, agreed to the proposal with enthusiasm that bordered on sociopathic. Contemporary court documents record his excitement about the revenue opportunities presented by systematic corpse commercialization, including detailed calculations of the potential profits from different execution techniques and body part pricing schedules. The Duke saw this as an innovative approach to criminal justice that would simultaneously punish lawbreakers and generate income for the state, while providing valuable medical services to citizens who could afford premium human flesh. Treatments. The implementation began with what Van Helmont termed execution optimization protocols. Court officials were instructed to evaluate prisoners not just for their crimes, but for their potential pharmaceutical value. Young, healthy criminals were prioritized for execution when demand for premium body parts was high. Older or diseased prisoners were delayed until market conditions improved or alternative applications could be found for lower quality corpse materials. The dialogue, preserved in court records, reveals the casual banality with which officials discussed systematic murder for profit. Van Helmont's correspondence with Duke Eberhard includes phrases like, "Current inventory levels of cardiac tissue are insufficient to meet demand from Munich apothecaries," and requesting authorization to expedite processing of 3 young thieves, currently scheduled for execution next month. The Duke's responses demonstrate equal comfort with treating human beings as commercial inventory, with notes like "approved for immediate processing" and "delay execution of the counterfeiter until market conditions improve for brain-based remedies." The play-by-play of the scandal's explosion began when a court clerk, apparently possessed of more moral sense than his superiors, leaked details of the Van Helmont contract to local religious authorities. The revelation that the state was systematically murdering people to supply pharmaceutical companies with fresh human ingredients sparked outrage that transcended typical political boundaries. Catholic and Protestant leaders, who rarely agreed on anything, united in condemnation of what they accurately describe as state-sponsored cannibalism disguised as criminal justice. Unexpected developments included the discovery that Van Helmont's operation had been supplying human flesh remedies to many of the same religious leaders who were now condemning the practice. Several prominent clergy members who had publicly denounced the execution contracts were revealed to be regular customers of Van Helmont's premium human flesh pharmacy, creating theological crises about whether consuming criminals was different from participating in their systematic murder for commercial purposes. The climax came when angry citizens stormed Van Helmont's processing facilities and discovered the full extent of the operation. The facilities included industrial-scale equipment for rendering human fat, specialized tools for harvesting specific organs, and detailed inventory records tracking which body parts came from which executed criminals. Most shocking was the discovery of a quality control laboratory where Van Helmont's assistants tested human flesh samples to ensure they met pharmaceutical standards before being processed into medicine. The immediate aftermath involved Duke Eberhard's hasty attempts to distance himself from the scandal, while Van Helmont fled to the Netherlands with whatever portable assets he could salvage from his collapsing pharmaceutical empire. Court records from the period reveal frantic efforts to destroy evidence of the execution contracts while simultaneously trying to maintain legal legitimacy for capital punishment procedures that hadn't been completely corrupted by commercial interests. The response was immediate, widespread, and revealed just how deeply the flesh trade had penetrated European society. Religious authorities across multiple denominations issued unprecedented joint condemnations of pharmaceutical cannibalism, though their moral outrage was somewhat undermined by the revelation that many church officials had been regular customers of human flesh remedies. The Catholic Church was forced to develop new theological positions on the difference between consuming human remains for medical purposes versus participating in systematic murder to obtain those remains. Various parties' reactions demonstrated the complex web of interests that had developed around the flesh trade. Competing apothecaries initially denounced Van Helmont's operation, not because they objected to using human ingredients, but because his exclusive contracts with execution authorities threatened their own access to fresh corpse supplies. Some physicians defended the practice by arguing that human flesh medicine represented cutting-edge medical science that shouldn't be abandoned due to squeamishness about ingredient sourcing. The immediate consequences included the collapse of Van Helmont's pharmaceutical empire and Duke Eberhard's political career. But the broader flesh trade continued operating with more discretion and better public relations. Other courts quietly discontinued their formal contracts with apothecaries while maintaining informal arrangements that provided continued access to executed criminals. The scandal didn't end pharmaceutical cannibalism. It just made the practice more sophisticated and less obviously criminal. Political fallout extended beyond Württemberg as other German states scrambled to distance themselves from similar arrangements with flesh merchants. Investigations revealed that Van Helmont's operation wasn't unique. Courts throughout the Holy Roman Empire had developed various forms of cooperation with apothecaries seeking access to fresh human materials. The scandal exposed a continental network of execution-based pharmaceutical supply chains that had been operating with official sanction for decades. How this changed everything was primarily cosmetic rather than substantive. The flesh trade became more discreet, with apothecaries developing indirect methods for obtaining human materials that avoided obvious conflicts of interest with judicial authorities. Instead of formal contracts with courts, pharmaceutical entrepreneurs established relationships with executioners, morgue attendants, and hospital officials who could provide access to human remains without direct involvement of legal authorities. The ironic outcomes included increased demand for human flesh remedies as the scandal generated publicity for products that many Europeans hadn't previously known existed. Van Helmont's downfall created market opportunities for competitors who could provide similar services with better operational security. The controversy also led to innovation in corpse processing techniques as apothecaries sought to maximize the value of whatever human materials they could obtain through less obvious supply chains. Most absurdly, the scandal resulted in improved quality control standards for human flesh. Medicine, as pharmaceutical entrepreneurs sought to differentiate their products from the controversial Van Helmont operation. Apothecaries began advertising that their human ingredients came from naturally deceased individuals rather than execution victims, creating a premium market segment for corpse-based remedies that claimed ethical sourcing of their human materials. The long-term consequences included the development of more sophisticated regulatory frameworks that appeared to restrict pharmaceutical cannibalism while actually legitimizing it through official oversight. Rather than banning human flesh medicine, authorities established licensing systems for apothecaries who demonstrated proper procedures for obtaining and processing human materials according to legal and ethical standards that were essentially meaningless but provided political cover for continued participation in the flesh trade. This execution scandal wasn't just about one corrupt duke making deals with an ambitious pharmaceutical entrepreneur. It revealed the fundamental problems with treating human beings as commercial commodities within systems that claimed moral and legal legitimacy. The Van Helmont affair demonstrated how quickly institutional corruption could develop when economic incentives aligned with human suffering, and how normal people could participate in obviously evil enterprises when those enterprises were presented as legitimate business opportunities. The deeper meaning extended beyond simple corruption to to reveal how European society had constructed elaborate justifications for systematic cannibalism that satisfied legal, religious, and medical authorities while providing commercial benefits to entrepreneurs willing to profit from human death. The flesh trade wasn't some underground criminal enterprise. It was a legitimate industry that operated with official sanction and social acceptance, demonstrating how easily civilized societies could normalize practices that were obviously barbaric to anyone with basic moral reasoning. What it revealed about the system was that European institutions prioritized economic opportunity over human dignity to such an extent that state-sponsored murder for commercial purposes seemed like reasonable public policy rather than obviously criminal behavior. Courts, churches, medical schools, and government authorities had all found ways to participate in or benefit from systematic cannibalism, while maintaining their claims to moral and intellectual authority. The long-term effects included the gradual development of more sophisticated methods for exploiting human suffering that avoided the obvious ethical problems of direct cannibalism while maintaining the same basic relationship between human death and commercial profit. The flesh trade evolved rather than disappeared, with entrepreneurs finding new ways to monetize human misery that were less obviously criminal, but equally exploitative. Why historians still debate it relates to uncomfortable questions about the relationship between legitimate medical authority and systematic human exploitation. The flesh trade demonstrates how easily respected institutions can become vehicles for obviously unethical practices when those practices are profitable and can be justified through expert authority and social acceptance. The scandal also raises questions about the continuity between historical and contemporary forms of medical exploitation, where desperate patients are treated as markets for expensive treatments rather than human beings deserving ethical care. The same institutional structures that enable pharmaceutical cannibalism still exist in modern healthcare systems, creating ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation that differ more in style than in substance from the human flesh trade that scandalized 17th century Europe. Around the main events of the international mummy trade and domestic execution scandals, a colorful cast of entrepreneurial cannibals played crucial roles in establishing human flesh medicine as a legitimate European industry. These weren't just background figures. They were the innovative pioneers who transformed eating dead people from occasional desperate measure into sophisticated commercial enterprise. Take Franciscus Sylvius, a Dutch physician who became legendary for developing the first standardized human skull preparation techniques in the early 1600s. Sylvius wasn't content with the traditional approach of grinding up random skull fragments and hoping for the best. He was a perfectionist who treated human head processing like fine cuisine preparation. His innovation was developing different skull powder grades based on the age, gender, and cause of death of the original owner, creating what amounted to a wine-tasting approach to cannibalistic medicine. Sylvius's significance extended beyond simple product development to include sophisticated marketing strategies that convinced wealthy Europeans they needed premium human skull products for optimal health. He published detailed medical treatises explaining why skull powder from young women was superior for treating hysteria, while skull powder from executed criminals was better for epilepsy, and skull powder from plague victims was ideal for infectious diseases. His business model was brilliant. Convince customers that generic skull powder was dangerous medical malpractice, while properly categorized skull powder was cutting-edge personalized medicine. The story of Sylvius becomes even more absurd when you learn that he established formal partnerships with hospitals, monasteries, and execution sites across the Netherlands to ensure steady supplies of properly categorized human heads. His operation included detailed record-keeping systems that tracked the medical history, age, and circumstances of death for every skull in his inventory. creating what historians now recognize as Europe's first comprehensive database of human remains used for commercial purposes. Johann Rudolf Glauber represented a different aspect of the flesh trade, the industrial chemist who transformed human body processing from artisanal craft into large-scale manufacturing. Glauber discovered that human body parts could be processed using advanced chemical techniques borrowed from metallurgy and soap production, creating refined products that were more potent and marketable than traditional ground-up corpse powder. Glauber's contribution to systematic cannibalism included developing distillation techniques for extracting essential oils from human organs, chemical purification methods for removing impurities from human fat, and preservation technologies that extended the shelf life of processed human materials. His laboratories were essentially chemical plants dedicated to industrial-scale corpse processing, complete with specialized equipment for rendering human bodies into various pharmaceutical products. Most importantly, Glauber proved that human flesh medicine could be mass-produced and distributed across international markets, transforming a local cottage industry into a multinational commercial enterprise. His innovations made human-based remedies accessible to middle-class customers who couldn't afford artisanal human flesh products but wanted to participate in cutting-edge, cannibalistic healthcare. The third crucial figure was Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit priest and scholar who provided theological and intellectual legitimacy for pharmaceutical cannibalism. Kircher wasn't directly involved in corpse processing, but his scholarly writings created the theoretical framework that allowed European Christians to consume human flesh while maintaining their religious and moral authority. Kircher's scholarly contributions included detailed theological arguments for why consuming pagan corpses was acceptable Christian behavior, scientific explanations for how human flesh contained medicinal properties that could be transferred to patients through careful preparation, and historical research that connected European cannibalistic medicine to ancient traditions that predated Christianity. His work provided intellectual cover for practices that were obviously unethical to anyone with basic moral reasoning. The significance of Kircher's role was that he transformed human flesh medicine from questionable folk practice into legitimate scholarly discipline supported by religious authority and academic research. His endorsement gave customers confidence that consuming ground-up criminals was sophisticated medical treatment rather than obvious moral degradation, while providing physicians with scholarly justification for prescribing cannibalistic remedies to their patients. Together, these three figures represent the different aspects of how European society normalized systematic cannibalism. Sylvius provided the commercial innovation, Glauber supplied the industrial infrastructure, and Kircher delivered the intellectual legitimacy. Their combined efforts transformed eating human beings from desperate survival behavior into respectable consumer activity for health-conscious Europeans who demanded the finest in corpse-based medical products. These weren't isolated incidents involving individual entrepreneurs operating independent cannibalism businesses. The flesh trade created complex webs of relationships that connected courts, churches, medical schools, and commercial enterprises across multiple countries in a continental network dedicated to systematic human consumption for profit. The connections between these stories reveal how the flesh trade operated like a sophisticated international business network, with different specialists providing complementary services that supported the overall industry. Sylvius's skull categorization systems provided the quality standards that Glauber's chemical processing facilities needed to ensure consistent product quality. Kircher's theological justifications gave religious cover for the commercial activities that both Sylvius and Glauber needed to operate without official persecution. Political and social networks extended beyond simple business relationships to include corrupt officials who facilitated corpse trafficking, religious authorities who provided moral legitimacy for cannibalistic commerce, and medical institutions that train new generations of physicians in human flesh prescription techniques. The University of Leiden, where Silvius taught, became a center for education in pharmaceutical cannibalism, with students learning proper techniques for evaluating human corpse quality and preparing various body parts for different medical applications. How? One event led to another demonstrates the self-reinforcing nature of the flesh trade expansion. Silvius's success in standardizing skull powder preparation created demand for similar quality control in other human body part markets, leading to Glauber's innovations in chemical processing techniques. Glauber's ability to mass-produce human flesh remedies created larger markets that required theological justification, driving demand for Kirch's scholarly work legitimizing cannibalistic medicine. The unintended consequences and connections reveal how the flesh trade influenced European society far beyond simple medical practice. The demand for fresh human materials created corruption in judicial systems as courts modified execution procedures to serve pharmaceutical needs. The commercial success of human flesh medicine encouraged grave robbing and corpse trafficking that destabilized traditional burial practices and community mourning rituals. Most significantly, the interconnected nature of the flesh trade meant that respectable European institutions became dependent on systematic cannibalism for their economic and social functioning. Medical schools needed human flesh curriculum to attract students. Pharmacies needed human body part inventory to remain competitive. Religious institutions needed theological frameworks that accommodated cannibalistic commerce. Government authorities needed tax revenue from flesh trade profits. The webs of relationships also included international connections that linked European flesh merchants with suppliers in Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and other regions where human remains could be obtained through different political and economic arrangements. Dutch traders who imported spices from Asia also imported mummies from Egypt. German merchants who sold manufactured goods to Eastern Europe also purchased fresh corpses from regions with different legal frameworks for corpse commercialization. Perhaps, most absurdly, the interconnected stories reveal how European families became integrated into flesh trade networks through multiple pathways simultaneously. Wealthy families purchased human flesh remedies for their medical needs while also profiting from investments in companies that processed human remains. Poor families sold deceased relatives to apothecaries while also working as employees in corpse processing facilities. Religious families have theological guidance about consuming human flesh while their churches received donations from flesh. Merchants seeking moral legitimacy. The networks also included unexpected participants like artists who created anatomical illustrations for human flesh marketing materials, writers who published testimonials about the medical benefits of cannibalistic remedies, and even musicians who performed at social events sponsored by successful flesh merchants. The flesh trade became so integrated into European society that avoiding participation required deliberate effort and often social isolation. The most revealing aspect of these interconnected stories is how they demonstrate the normalization of obviously evil practices through institutional legitimization and social acceptance. Individual participants could rationalize their involvement by pointing to the participation of respected authorities. If universities were teaching human flesh medicine, if churches were providing theological approval, if governments were collecting taxes on corpse sales, then individual participation seemed like responsible citizenship rather than complicity in systematic cannibalism. The connections ultimately reveal how the flesh trade operated as a comprehensive social system rather than simply a medical practice, with economic, political, religious, and cultural components that reinforced each other and created powerful incentives for continued expansion of cannibalistic commerce throughout European society. To understand the flesh trade phenomenon, you have to understand the broader cultural context of early modern Europe, where daily life was shaped by assumptions about human hierarchy, bodily humors, and medical authority that made systematic cannibalism seem like rational healthcare rather than obvious moral abomination. Daily life in 17th century Europe involved constant exposure to death, disease, and human suffering that modern people would find traumatic, but which contemporary Europeans accepted as normal background conditions. Public executions were popular entertainment events. Open sewers ran through city streets. Dead bodies were commonly visible in hospitals, morgues, and private homes where people died without professional medical intervention. The smell of human decay was familiar to everyone, making the transition from smelling dead people to eating dead people less psychologically challenging than it would be for modern populations. Beliefs and attitudes about human bodies were fundamentally different from contemporary perspectives. Europeans believed that physical health depended on balancing different bodily humors that could be influenced by consuming materials that contained the desired qualities. If someone needed more courage, consuming the heart of a brave person seemed logical. If someone suffered from mental illness, eating the brain of an intelligent person appeared scientifically reasonable. The cannibalistic logic wasn't considered savage or primitive. It was considered sophisticated medical science based on the best available theoretical frameworks. Social structures that enabled the flesh trade included rigid class hierarchies that dehumanized poor people, criminals, and foreigners to the extent that using their bodies as medical ingredients didn't trigger moral concerns among wealthy consumers. Europeans already accepted that poor people existed primarily to serve wealthy people's needs, so converting poor people's corpses into wealthy people's medicine seemed like natural extension of existing social relationships rather than revolutionary. Moral transgression. What was normal versus exceptional reveals how thoroughly European society had normalized practices that should have been recognized as obviously unethical. Normal medical practice included prescribing human flesh remedies for common ailments. Normal pharmaceutical inventory included ground-up human body parts alongside plant and mineral ingredients. Normal business relationships included partnerships between apothecaries and executioners for corpse supply arrangements. Normal religious practice included theological discussions about the proper Christian approach to consuming pagan corpses for medical purposes. The exceptional elements were limited to technical innovations in corpse processing techniques, particularly successful marketing strategies for human flesh products, and occasionally elaborate execution contracts that attracted negative publicity. But the basic practice of systematic cannibalism for medical purposes was completely mainstream and socially acceptable behavior for educated, respectable Europeans who participated without experiencing moral conflict or social stigma. How this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you realize that the flesh trade operated with broad social support rather than despite social opposition. European customers weren't being forced to buy human flesh medicine. They were demanding access to what they believed were premium medical products that demonstrated their sophistication and commitment to cutting-edge healthcare. The cultural context created demand for cannibalistic medicine rather than resistance to it, enabling entrepreneurs to build profitable businesses around systematic human consumption. Perhaps most delicious was the contradiction between European Christian claims of moral superiority over other cultures while simultaneously operating the most sophisticated cannibalistic commerce in world history. Europeans condemned other societies for practicing human sacrifice or ritual cannibalism, while they were literally industrializing human consumption for medical purposes, creating supply chains for systematic corpse processing that exceeded anything practiced by the supposedly savage cultures they criticized. The examples of contradictions include respected physicians who condemned superstition and ignorance while prescribing remedies made from ground-up criminals based on ancient texts and popular folklore. Religious authorities who preached about the sanctity of human life while providing theological justification for converting human bodies into consumer products. Government officials who claimed to represent civilized legal authority while modifying execution procedures to serve pharmaceutical commercial interests. How things weren't what they seemed becomes apparent when you realize that European medical authority was largely based on systematic fraud, with physicians prescribing treatments they knew were ineffective or harmful, because those treatments were profitable and socially prestigious. The flesh trade wasn't aberrant behavior by marginal characters. It was mainstream medical practice supported by the most respected institutions in European society. The medical establishment that claimed scientific authority was actually operating according to principles that were obviously unscientific to anyone with basic logical reasoning. The same physicians who dismissed folk remedies as ignorant superstition were prescribing medicines made from Egyptian mummies and executed criminals based on theoretical frameworks that were equally ridiculous but more expensive and socially prestigious. Modern parallels to these contradictions are uncomfortably obvious for anyone familiar with contemporary healthcare systems that prioritize profit over patient welfare, expensive treatments over effective treatments, and expert authority over scientific evidence. The same institutional structures that enabled respected physicians to prescribe ground-up humans as medicine still exist in modern medical systems, creating ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation that differ more in style than in substance. From 17th century pharmaceutical cannibalism, most ironically, the flesh trade demonstrates how easily civilized societies can convince themselves that obviously evil practices are actually sophisticated and beneficial, especially when those practices are profitable for respected authorities and provide psychological comfort for desperate people seeking solutions to problems beyond their control. The gap between European self-perception as advanced civilization and European reality as cannibalistic commercial enterprise reveals how cultural narratives about progress and sophistication can mask systematic moral degradation that operates with broad social acceptance and institutional support. Everything changed when a few inconveniently honest physicians began asking uncomfortable questions about whether consuming human flesh actually cured anything, or whether their patients were just experiencing very expensive placebo effects while slowly poisoning themselves with decomposed criminals. The background to this medical revolution wasn't some dramatic scientific breakthrough. It was the gradual accumulation of evidence that human flesh remedies were killing more patients than they were helping, combined with the emergence of alternative treatments that were both more effective and less obviously evil. Why this moment was different relates to several factors converging simultaneously to undermine the theoretical foundations of cannibalistic medicine. First, European physicians were beginning to develop more sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology through direct observation rather than relying exclusively on ancient texts and popular superstitions. Second, international trade was introducing European markets to new medicinal plants and chemical compounds that provided effective treatments without requiring systematic grave robbing. Third, religious reform movements were questioning the theological justifications that had legitimized pharmaceutical cannibalism for centuries. The key factors that led to transformation included the rise of empirical observation as a medical practice, where physicians began systematically tracking patient outcomes, rather than simply assuming that expensive treatments were effective treatments. When doctors started keeping detailed records of what happened to patients who consumed human flesh remedies, the results were embarrassingly obvious. People who ate ground up criminals weren't getting healthier. They were getting sicker. often developing mysterious illnesses that correlated directly with their consumption of processed human remains. Economic factors also contributed to the shift, as European markets became flooded with alternative medicines that were cheaper to produce, easier to source, and didn't require maintaining complex supply chains for fresh human corpses. Plant-based remedies imported from Asia and the Americas provided effective treatments for conditions that had previously been treated with human flesh, while chemical compounds developed by innovative apothecaries offered standardized products that didn't depend on variable supplies of executed criminals. Perhaps most importantly, the social costs of maintaining cannibalistic medicine were becoming impossible to ignore. The flesh trade had created widespread corruption in judicial systems, religious institutions, and medical establishments that was undermining public confidence in European civilization's claims to moral and intellectual authority. Government officials were discovering that taxing systematic cannibalism was generating international criticism that outweighed the commercial benefits of supporting pharmaceutical corpse processing. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual process where respectable physicians began quietly reducing their prescriptions of human flesh remedies while publicly maintaining that cannibalistic medicine remained valid for appropriate cases. Apothecaries started emphasizing their plant and mineral-based products while discreetly reducing their human body part inventory. Religious authorities began developing new theological positions that discouraged human flesh consumption without explicitly condemning previous church endorsements of cannibalistic medicine. Most significantly, wealthy customers who had been the primary market for premium human flesh remedies began demanding alternative treatments that provided similar social prestige without the increasing social stigma associated with consuming processed criminals. The same psychological needs that had driven demand for exotic, human-based medicines could be satisfied by expensive imported plant remedies or sophisticated chemical compounds that demonstrated wealth and medical sophistication without requiring participation in systematic cannibalism. The shift represented the beginning of the end for pharmaceutical cannibalism as mainstream European medical practice, though the transition would take decades to complete and would never entirely eliminate human flesh medicine from European pharmacies. How change unfolded reveals the complex politics of abandoning systematic cannibalism while maintaining medical authority and commercial profitability. European physicians couldn't simply announce that human flesh medicine was ineffective quackery without admitting they had been systematically poisoning their patients for centuries while charging premium prices for the privilege. The medical establishment needed to engineer a gradual transition that preserved professional credibility while phasing out obviously problematic practices. Resistance to change came from multiple sources with different motivations for preserving cannibalistic medicine. Established apothecaries had invested heavily in corpse processing infrastructure and supply chain relationships that would become worthless if human flesh remedies were abandoned. Wealthy customers who had spent fortunes on premium human body part medicines didn't want to admit they had been wasting money on ineffective treatments. Religious authorities who had provided theological justification for pharmaceutical cannibalism couldn't acknowledge that church-endorsed medicine was actually systematic sin disguised as healthcare. The most sophisticated resistance came from medical schools and scholarly institutions that had built their reputations on expertise in human flesh preparation and prescription techniques. Academic physicians had published treatises, developed curricula, and established professional credentials based on their knowledge of cannibalistic medicine. Abandoning human flesh treatments would require acknowledging that European medical education had been fundamentally wrong about basic principles of healthcare for generations. Champions of change included a small but growing number of physicians who were willing to risk professional ostracism by questioning established medical practices and demanding evidence of effectiveness. rather than relying on ancient authority and popular tradition. These medical reformers began conducting what amounted to primitive clinical trials, systematically comparing patient outcomes between human flesh treatments and alternative remedies to demonstrate that cannibalistic medicine was not only ineffective but actively harmful. The specific steps and stages of transformation began with individual physicians quietly reducing their prescriptions of human flesh remedies, while maintaining public support for cannibalistic medicine as a legitimate treatment option. This allowed reformist doctors to test alternative approaches without directly challenging medical orthodoxy or risking persecution by conservative colleagues who remained committed to traditional corpse-based treatments. Obstacles encountered included violent opposition from flesh merchants, who recognized that medical reform threatened their profitable businesses, political resistance from government authorities, who collected significant tax revenue from the human body parts trade, and social pressure from wealthy customers who had built their identities around consumption of premium human flesh medicines and didn't want to acknowledge they had been participating in expensive fraud. The breakthrough moments came when several high-profile medical disasters conclusively demonstrated the dangers of human flesh medicine to audiences that couldn't be ignored or silenced by medical authorities. When members of prominent noble families died from consuming contaminated human flesh remedies, when religious leaders contracted mysterious illnesses after years of eating processed criminals, when court physicians were caught selling fake human body parts to their own patients, the accumulated evidence became impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Role of individuals versus larger forces reveals how medical transformation required both courageous individual physicians willing to challenge established practices and broader social changes that created receptive audiences for alternative approaches. Individual reformers provided the intellectual leadership and clinical evidence needed to discredit cannibalistic medicine, but their efforts would have been futile without concurrent developments in international trade, religious reform, and political modernization that created social contexts where medical change was possible. The process also involved creative rebranding strategies where apothecaries maintained commercial viability by transitioning from human flesh specialists to exotic plant medicine experts, using their existing customer relationships and marketing expertise to promote alternative products that satisfied similar psychological needs for expensive, sophisticated medical treatments. Many flesh merchants successfully reinvented themselves as importers of rare Asian herbs or manufacturers of complex chemical compounds, preserving their businesses while abandoning systematic cannibalism. Perhaps most importantly, the change process required developing new forms of medical authority that could replace the traditional reliance on ancient texts, religious endorsement, and social prestige. Reformist physicians began emphasizing empirical observation, systematic testing, and reproducible results as sources of medical knowledge, creating foundations for modern scientific medicine that would eventually make cannibalistic treatments seem obviously ridiculous rather than respectably traditional. The gradual nature of the transformation allowed European society to abandon systematic cannibalism without acknowledging the full extent of the moral catastrophe that centuries of pharmaceutical cannibalism represented, enabling a relatively smooth transition that preserved institutional legitimacy while eliminating obviously problematic practices. The new medical landscape that emerged in the late 1600s and early 1700s was characterized by an uneasy coexistence between reformist physicians, promoting evidence-based treatments, and traditional practitioners who continued prescribing human flesh remedies for customers who specifically requested cannibalistic medicine. This wasn't a clean break from the past. It was a messy transition period where European pharmacies simultaneously stocked ground-up criminals alongside imported plant medicines, allowing customers to choose between traditional corpse-based treatments and modern alternative remedies. How things were different becomes apparent when you examine the changing inventory of European apothecaries during this transition period. Shops that had previously featured prominent displays of human skull powder and mummy fragments began emphasizing their collections of exotic plants, chemical compounds, and mineral-based remedies. Human body parts didn't disappear entirely. They were discreetly relocated to back rooms where traditional customers could still purchase cannibalistic medicines without exposing the practice to growing public criticism. Who won and who lost? In this transformation reveals the complex politics of medical reform. Progressive physicians gained professional credibility and expanded their practices by offering effective treatments that didn't require participation in systematic grave robbing. Innovative apothecaries who successfully transitioned from flesh merchants to plant medicine specialists maintained their commercial success while avoiding the social stigma increasingly associated with cannibalistic commerce. The obvious losers included traditional flesh merchants who had invested heavily in corpse processing infrastructure and supply chain, relationships that became worthless as demand for human body part medicines declined. Executioners lost lucrative side businesses selling criminal corpses to pharmaceutical companies. Corrupt court officials could no longer supplement their incomes through execution, scheduling services for apothecaries seeking fresh human materials. New rules and norms gradually emerged that discouraged human flesh medicine without explicitly banning cannibalistic treatments, allowing European society to abandon systematic corpse consumption while avoiding acknowledgement of the moral implications of centuries of pharmaceutical cannibalism. Medical schools began de-emphasizing human flesh preparation techniques in their curricula while maintaining that such knowledge remained valuable for understanding traditional medical practices. Professional medical associations developed informal guidelines that discouraged prescribing human flesh remedies for routine conditions while maintaining that cannibalistic treatments might still be appropriate for exceptional cases where conventional alternatives had proven ineffective. This created social pressure for physicians to avoid human flesh prescriptions without requiring explicit condemnation of traditional medical practices. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals how European medical transformation preserved institutional authority while modifying specific practices. The basic relationship between wealthy patients and prestigious physicians remained unchanged. People still paid premium prices for exotic treatments that demonstrated their sophistication and access to cutting-edge medical knowledge. The social functions of expensive medicine as status symbol and anxiety management tool persisted even as the specific ingredients shifted from human body parts to rare plants and complex chemicals. The fundamental problem of medical authority, based on tradition, social prestige, and customer satisfaction rather than scientific evidence, also remained largely unchanged. Physicians continued prescribing treatments based on theoretical frameworks that were mostly speculative rather than empirically validated, meaning that post-cannibalism European medicine was still largely ineffective even if it was less obviously evil. Most significantly, the institutional structures that had enabled systematic cannibalism, unregulated medical practice, commercial healthcare, and treatment of human bodies as potential commodities remained intact and would continue, creating opportunities for medical exploitation that differed more in style than in substance from the human flesh trade that had scandalized earlier generations of Europeans who somehow convinced themselves they were more civilized than their cannibalistic predecessors. Was this change actually progress, or just a cosmetic modification that preserved the fundamental problems while eliminating the most obviously scandalous practices? Different perspectives on this question reveal the complexity of evaluating medical transformation that occurred primarily for social and economic reasons rather than genuine scientific advancement. From one perspective, The decline of pharmaceutical cannibalism represented genuine moral progress as European society finally recognized that systematic consumption of human flesh was obviously unethical, regardless of claimed medical benefits. The transition to plant and chemical-based remedies eliminated the corruption of judicial systems, the desecration of burial sites, and the commercial exploitation of human death that had characterized the flesh trade for centuries. The short-term effects were clearly beneficial for European society, as the abandonment of cannibalistic medicine reduced social corruption, eliminated obvious forms of systematic evil, and created space for medical practices that were at least potentially beneficial rather than obviously harmful. Patients were no longer being slowly poisoned with contaminated human remains. Grave robbing was no longer a legitimate pharmaceutical supply chain activity, and courts were no longer modifying execution procedures to serve commercial interests. However, the long-term effects were more ambiguous because the transformation preserved the institutional structures that had enabled systematic cannibalism while simply redirecting them toward different forms of medical exploitation. The same unregulated medical markets, profit-driven healthcare systems, and treatment of desperate patients as commercial opportunities that had created demand for human flesh medicine continued operating with different products but similar exploitative relationships. Unintended consequences included the development of more sophisticated methods for medical fraud that were harder to detect and criticize than obvious cannibalism. Plant-based medicine and chemical treatments could be marketed with elaborate, scientific-sounding explanations that were just as speculative as the theories that had justified eating criminals, but which appeared more legitimate because they didn't involve obvious moral violations. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how historical evaluation of medical progress depends heavily on the standards used for assessment. Contemporary Europeans generally viewed the transition away from cannibalistic medicine as evidence of advancing civilization and scientific sophistication, while modern observers might see it as merely replacing one form of medical quackery with others that were less obviously evil but equally ineffective. The most honest evaluation acknowledges that European medicine became less morally offensive without becoming significantly more scientifically valid, representing incremental improvement rather than fundamental transformation of the relationship between medical authority and human exploitation that continues to characterize healthcare systems that prioritize profit over patient welfare. In the years and decades that followed the gradual decline of mainstream cannibalistic medicine, European pharmacies evolved into something that would have looked familiar to modern observers. Shops filled with exotic plants, chemical compounds, and mysterious tonics that promised miraculous cures without requiring customers to consume processed criminals. But beneath this veneer of civilized progress, the fundamental dynamics that had created demand for human flesh, medicine continued operating with different products and more sophisticated marketing strategies. How things developed reveals the persistence of the same psychological and economic factors that had made systematic cannibalism profitable for centuries. European customers still wanted expensive, exotic treatments that demonstrated their sophistication and access to cutting-edge medical knowledge. Physicians still needed products they could prescribe with confidence, regardless of actual effectiveness. Apothecaries still required profitable merchandise that justified premium pricing through complex preparation methods and rare ingredients. The new challenges that emerged included increased competition from international suppliers, who could provide plant-based medicines at lower costs than traditional European flesh merchants. Growing customer sophistication that demanded better explanations for medical claims, and occasional scandals when reformed apothecaries were caught selling fake plant medicines or relabeling old human flesh inventory as exotic herbal remedies. Evolution of the situation included the development of more elaborate theoretical frameworks for explaining How plant and chemical medicines worked, creating pseudoscientific justifications that were just as speculative as the theories that had supported cannibalistic treatments, but which sounded more legitimate because they avoided obvious moral violations. European medical schools began teaching courses in botany and chemistry instead of human flesh preparation, though the basic approach of memorizing traditional claims rather than testing effectiveness remained unchanged. Second-generation effects included the emergence of new forms of medical fraud that were harder to detect than obvious cannibalism. Apothecaries discovered they could make extraordinary profits by importing common plants from distant regions and marketing them as rare medicinal herbs with miraculous properties. Chemical compounds could be manufactured using simple techniques, then sold as sophisticated pharmaceutical innovations developed through advanced scientific research. The most significant development was the gradual shift from local flesh sourcing to international plant importing, which created new opportunities for exploitation while eliminating the obvious social costs of systematic grave robbing. European merchants could purchase inexpensive plant materials from Asian and American suppliers, then process and market them as premium medical products for European customers, who were willing to pay extraordinary prices for treatments that appeared more sophisticated and exotic than traditional local remedies. This transformation represented the globalization of medical exploitation, where European commercial interests could extract profits from desperate patients without the direct social costs of corrupting local judicial systems or desecrating community burial sites. The same entrepreneurial energy that had created sophisticated supply chains for human corpses was redirected toward developing international networks for plant medicine that were less obviously evil, but equally profitable for merchants willing to exploit customer desperation and medical ignorance. The aftermath also included persistent underground markets for traditional human flesh remedies, as some customers remained convinced that cannibalistic medicine was superior to plant-based alternatives and were willing to pay premium prices for apothecaries who could discreetly supply processed human materials. These markets operated with greater secrecy and sophistication than the previous open trade, creating opportunities for specialized merchants who could cater to customers seeking traditional corpse-based treatments. The transformation of European medicine created opportunities for innovative entrepreneurs who could profit from the transition away from obvious cannibalism, while maintaining the commercial dynamics that had made human flesh medicine so lucrative. These new figures differed from earlier flesh merchants, primarily in their choice of raw materials rather than their basic approach to exploiting customer desperation through expensive, exotic treatments. Johann Jacob Wepfer emerged as a pioneer in what historians now call botanical cannibalism, the practice of marketing plant-based medicines using the same psychological strategies that had made human flesh remedies profitable. Wepfer discovered that European customers would pay extraordinary prices for rare plants that were marketed with stories about their discovery, exotic origins, and miraculous properties, especially when those plants were prepared using complex techniques that appeared sophisticated and scientific. Wepfer's role involved developing elaborate backstories for common medicinal plants, transforming ordinary herbs into premium products through creative marketing and sophisticated packaging. His innovation was recognizing that customers weren't really buying medical effectiveness. They were purchasing social prestige, psychological comfort, and participation in what appeared to be cutting-edge scientific medicine. By providing these psychological benefits through plant-based products instead of human flesh, Wepfer could satisfy customer needs while avoiding the social stigma increasingly associated with cannibalistic commerce. His contributions included establishing international supply chains for exotic plants, developing standardized preparation techniques that appeared scientific and sophisticated, and creating marketing materials that explained how plant-based medicines worked. according to theoretical frameworks that were just as speculative as previous justifications for eating criminals, but which sounded more legitimate to customers seeking alternatives to obvious cannibalism. The specific stories about Wepfer's operations include his development of American Wonder Root, a common North American plant that he marketed as a miraculous cure discovered by indigenous healers and processed according to secret techniques that enhanced its natural healing properties. The product was essentially expensive dirt, but Wepfer's marketing was so sophisticated that wealthy Europeans paid fortunes for what they believed was access to revolutionary medical knowledge from the New World. Nicholas Lemery represented a fond of different aspect of the post-cannibalism medical transformation, the chemical entrepreneur who discovered that synthetic compounds could be marketed as advanced pharmaceutical innovations that surpassed traditional plant and mineral remedies. Through superior scientific development, Lemery's approach involved creating simple chemical mixtures using basic laboratory techniques, then marketing them as sophisticated pharmaceutical breakthroughs developed through cutting-edge research. How Lemery differed from earlier players was his emphasis on scientific authority rather than traditional medical knowledge or exotic sourcing. Instead of claiming his products were effective because they contained rare ingredients or followed ancient preparation methods, Lemery marketed his chemical compounds as superior because they were created through rational scientific processes that improved upon natural materials through human innovation and understanding. His contributions to the evolving medical marketplace included developing standardized chemical manufacturing techniques that could produce consistent products, creating theoretical explanations for how synthetic compounds worked that appeared more scientific than traditional medical theories, and establishing quality control systems that reassured customers they were receiving genuine pharmaceutical innovations rather than traditional remedies disguised with scientific language. The disruptions created by these new chemical approaches included competition with traditional plant-based medicine merchants, customer confusion about the relative merits of natural versus synthetic treatments, and ongoing debates within medical communities about whether chemical compounds represented genuine scientific advancement or simply more sophisticated forms of the same speculative medicine that had characterized European healthcare for centuries. Together, these new players demonstrated how European medical commerce adapted to changing social conditions while preserving the fundamental dynamics that had made systematic cannibalism profitable, redirecting entrepreneurial energy toward plant and chemical-based exploitation that was less obviously evil, but equally based on customer desperation and medical ignorance. But some problems persisted despite the transition away from obvious cannibalism, revealing how the abandonment of human flesh medicine addressed symptoms rather than causes of European medical dysfunction. The fundamental issues that had created demand for systematic corpse consumption, unregulated medical practice, profit-driven healthcare, and treatment of desperate patients as commercial opportunities continued operating with different products but similar exploitative relationships. Continuing challenges included the persistence of medical fraud that was harder to detect than obvious cannibalism, but equally harmful to patients seeking effective treatment. Apothecaries discovered they could generate enormous profits by selling common plants and simple chemical compounds as miraculous cures, using sophisticated marketing and pseudoscientific explanations that were just as speculative as previous justifications for eating criminals, but which appeared more legitimate because they avoided obvious moral violations. What didn't get resolved was the basic problem of medical authority based on tradition, social prestige, and customer satisfaction rather than scientific evidence. European physicians continued prescribing treatments based on theoretical frameworks that were mostly speculative, meaning that post-cannibalism medicine remained largely ineffective even if it was less obviously evil. The same institutional structures that had enabled systematic human flesh commerce continue creating opportunities for medical exploitation. New versions of old problems emerged as European medical markets became flooded with exotic plant medicines and synthetic chemical compounds that promised miraculous results through expensive, complex treatments. Customers who had previously sought social prestige through consumption of premium human body parts now sought similar status through purchase of rare plants and sophisticated chemicals, maintaining the same psychological dynamics that had driven demand for cannibalistic medicine. Cyclical patterns revealed how European medical commerce repeatedly created new forms of exploitation to replace abandoned practices, demonstrating the persistence of underlying economic and social factors that prioritize profit over patient welfare. Each wave of medical reform eliminated specific problematic practices while preserving the commercial relationships and institutional structures that created demand for expensive, ineffective treatments marketed to desperate patients. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to the fundamental contradiction between treating healthcare as commercial enterprise and providing effective medical care to people who need it. European society had organized medical practice around profit maximization rather than health optimization, creating systems where expensive treatments were assumed to be superior treatments, regardless of actual effectiveness. The most persistent problem was the continuation of class-based healthcare, where wealthy people received expensive treatments that demonstrated their social status, while poor people received minimal care or were used as experimental subjects for testing new treatments. The transition from cannibalistic to plant-based medicine preserved these hierarchical relationships, while simply changing the specific products used to maintain social distinctions. Underground markets for traditional human flesh remedies also persisted, as some customers remained convinced that cannibalistic medicine was superior to plant-based alternatives and were willing to pay premium prices for discreet access to processed human materials. These markets operated with greater secrecy but maintained the same basic commercial relationships between flesh merchants and customers seeking traditional corpse-based treatments. Perhaps most significantly, the problems included the development of more sophisticated methods for medical exploitation that were harder to criticize than obvious cannibalism. European medical entrepreneurs learned to avoid practices that generated obvious moral outrage while maintaining commercial strategies that exploited customer desperation through expensive treatments that provided psychological comfort rather than medical effectiveness. The ongoing issues ultimately demonstrated how cosmetic medical reform could create appearances of progress while preserving fundamental problems, allowing European society to congratulate itself for abandoning systematic cannibalism while continuing to operate healthcare systems that prioritize commercial interests over patient welfare through less obviously offensive but equally exploitative methods. Compared to the earlier period of open cannibalistic commerce, post-reform European medicine represented incremental improvement rather than fundamental transformation of the relationship between medical authority and commercial exploitation. The transition from human flesh to plant-based remedies eliminated the most obviously scandalous practices while preserving the institutional structures and economic incentives that had made systematic corpse consumption profitable for centuries. What was unique about the cannibalistic period was its combination of systematic scale, social acceptance, and institutional legitimacy that enabled European society to organize entire industries around consumption of human remains while maintaining claims to moral and intellectual superiority. Few other historical examples demonstrate such thorough normalization of obviously evil practices through expert authority and commercial success. What was universal about European medical exploitation? was the basic pattern of treating desperate patients as commercial opportunities, using sophisticated marketing to sell expensive treatments regardless of effectiveness, and employing expert authority to legitimize practices that primarily benefited merchants and physicians, rather than patients seeking genuine medical care. The lessons that could be learned from comparing cannibalistic and post-cannibalistic European medicine include the importance of regulatory oversight for medical claims, the dangers of profit-driven healthcare systems, and the persistence of exploitative relationships that adapt to changing social conditions, while maintaining fundamental commercial dynamics that prioritize merchant interests over patient welfare. Patterns that repeated elsewhere reveal how medical exploitation operates across different cultural and historical contexts, with similar psychological and economic factors creating demand for expensive, exotic treatments that provide social prestige and psychological comfort rather than genuine medical effectiveness. The European flesh trade demonstrates principles that apply to medical fraud and exploitation in various societies and time periods. Compared to modern times, historical European medicine reveals uncomfortable continuities in the relationship between medical authority and commercial exploitation, where expensive treatments are assumed to be superior treatments. Desperate patients are treated as profitable markets, and regulatory systems focus more on legitimizing existing practices than protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. The comparative analysis also reveals how societies can rapidly normalize practices that should be recognized as obviously unethical when those practices are presented as sophisticated, beneficial, and socially acceptable by respected authorities. The same psychological mechanisms that convinced Europeans to purchase ground-up criminals as medicine continue operating in modern contexts where people make healthcare decisions based on marketing claims rather than scientific evidence. Most importantly, the comparison demonstrates how institutional legitimacy can be used to justify practices that violate basic moral principles, creating systems where normal people participate in obviously harmful activities while maintaining their self-perception as responsible, ethical citizens. The European flesh trade provides a historical case study in how civilized societies can organize systematic evil through commercial and professional institutions that appear legitimate and beneficial to participants who are either unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge the moral implications of their participation. The analysis ultimately reveals patterns of medical exploitation that transcend specific historical contexts, demonstrating how commercial healthcare systems create ongoing vulnerabilities to abuse that require constant vigilance and regulatory oversight to prevent the emergence of new forms of systematic patient exploitation. By the early 1700s, signs pointed to the inevitable end of human flesh medicine as even a marginal medical practice, though the warning signs were often subtle and easily missed by participants who had built their careers and fortunes around systematic cannibalism disguised as sophisticated healthcare. The most telling indicator wasn't dramatic public opposition or government regulation. It was the quiet emergence of genuinely effective medical treatments that made human flesh remedies seem obviously ridiculous rather than respectably traditional. Warning. Signs included the growing influence of physicians who had been educated in newer medical schools that emphasized direct observation and systematic testing rather than memorization of ancient texts and traditional authorities. These younger doctors were less invested in preserving cannibalistic practices and more interested in developing treatments that actually helped patients, creating generational tensions within medical communities where established practitioners defended human flesh medicine while emerging professionals pursued alternatives. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex psychology of abandoning profitable practices that had provided social status and commercial success for generations. Established flesh merchants recognized the demand for human body part medicines was declining, but many interpreted this as temporary market fluctuation rather than permanent shift in customer preferences. They continued investing in corpse processing infrastructure and supply chain relationships, expecting that public enthusiasm for cannibalistic medicine would eventually return. Some apothecaries attempted to adapt by developing hybrid products that combined traditional human flesh ingredients with newer plant and chemical compounds, creating remedies that appealed to customers seeking both traditional authenticity and modern innovation. These transitional products satisfied nobody. Traditionalists considered them corrupted versions of proven remedies, while progressive customers viewed them as outdated compromise solutions that lacked the scientific credibility of purely plant or chemical-based medicines. Resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources with different reasons for preserving human flesh medicine. Medical schools that had built their reputations on expertise in cannibalistic treatments faced institutional crises when their specialized knowledge became socially unacceptable. Professors who had spent decades developing sophisticated theories about human flesh preparation couldn't easily transition to teaching plant-based medicine without acknowledging that their previous expertise was worthless. The most desperate resistance came from aging apothecaries who had invested their life savings in corpse processing equipment and human body part inventory that was becoming increasingly difficult to sell. Some attempted to rebrand their operations as historical medical museums while secretly continuing to supply traditional customers who specifically requested authentic human flesh remedies. Others tried relocating to rural areas where conservative customers might be more receptive to traditional cannibalistic treatments. Religious authorities faced particularly complex challenges as they struggled to withdraw theological support for practices they had previously endorsed without admitting that church-sanctioned medicine had been systematically promoting sinful behavior. Some clergy attempted to distinguish between acceptable historical use of human flesh medicine and contemporary practices that should be discouraged, creating theological frameworks that preserve past church authority while discouraging future. Cannibalistic commerce. The warning signs ultimately revealed how social change could gradually undermine practices that had seemed permanently established, demonstrating the vulnerability of institutions that base their authority on tradition and social acceptance rather than demonstrable effectiveness or genuine moral legitimacy. How the era of pharmaceutical cannibalism ended wasn't through dramatic legal bans or moral crusades, but through the quietly devastating process of becoming medically irrelevant. As European healthcare gradually developed treatments that were obviously superior to consuming processed criminals, the death of human flesh medicine was more like a business going bankrupt than a revolution overthrowing established authority. Customers simply stopped buying products that seemed primitive and ineffective compared to available alternatives. Specific events that marked the transition included the establishment of the first modern medical schools that refused to include human flesh preparation in their curricula, treating cannibalistic medicine as historical curiosity rather than legitimate medical practice. When prestigious institutions like the University of Edinburgh and the University of Leiden began graduating physicians who had never been trained in corpse-based treatments, the professional credibility of human flesh medicine collapsed among educated medical practitioners. The final major players in the flesh trade included a handful of elderly apothecaries who continued operating traditional cannibalistic pharmacies for increasingly small populations of conservative customers who refused to abandon familiar treatments. These last practitioners were often viewed with a mixture of nostalgia and embarrassment by communities that had once celebrated their expertise in human body part preparation, representing the awkward persistence of obviously outdated practices. In societies that were trying to modernize their self-image, last attempts to preserve human Flesh medicine included efforts to rebrand cannibalistic treatments as traditional European medicine that deserved preservation alongside other cultural practices, arguing that abandoning corpse-based remedies represented loss of valuable historical knowledge rather than moral progress. Some advocates attempted to distinguish between ethical and unethical sources of human materials, proposing that flesh medicine could continue using naturally deceased individuals, while avoiding the grave robbing and execution contracts that had generated public criticism. The dramatic final moments of organized flesh trading occurred when the last major suppliers of processed human materials were forced to liquidate their inventories through estate sales that attracted curious collectors rather than medical customers. Contemporary newspaper advertisements from the period include listings for antique medical curiosities and historical pharmaceutical specimens that were obviously ground-up human remains being sold as collectibles rather than medicine. Perhaps the most symbolic endpoint was the 1747 auction of Dr. Johann Baptist van Helmont's pharmaceutical equipment. Following his death, where the specialized tools for human corpse processing were purchased by metal dealers who melted them down for scrap rather than medical practitioners seeking to continue cannibalistic operations. The auction catalog, preserved in German archives, provides detailed descriptions of industrial-scale flesh processing equipment that had once represented cutting-edge medical technology but was considered worthless junk by the time of Van Helmont's death. The gradual decline also included the transformation of former flesh merchants into legitimate pharmaceutical entrepreneurs who used their customer relationships and marketing expertise to promote plant and chemical-based medicines. Many successful cannibalistic businesses evolved into respectable apothecaries that carefully avoided mentioning their historical involvement in systematic corpse processing, creating institutional amnesia that allowed former flesh traders to maintain commercial success while abandoning their previous practices. Some communities attempted to preserve the memory of local flesh merchants as colorful historical characters rather than systematic cannibals, developing folklore that romanticized the human body parts trade as quaint traditional practice rather than obvious moral abomination. These revisionist narratives allowed European societies to acknowledge their cannibalistic past while avoiding uncomfortable questions about how respected institutions had organized systematic consumption of human flesh for commercial purposes. The end process also revealed how quickly social practices could disappear once they lost institutional support and commercial viability. Within a generation, human flesh medicine transformed from mainstream medical practice to historical curiosity, demonstrating how thoroughly social acceptance could evaporate when underlying economic and institutional factors changed. Most significantly, the ending demonstrated the difference between eliminating specific practices and addressing underlying problems, as the institutional structures that had enabled systematic cannibalism continued operating with different products and methods. The death of human flesh medicine represented successful elimination of obvious moral violations rather than fundamental reform of commercial healthcare systems that continued prioritizing profit over patient welfare through less obviously offensive but equally exploitative approaches. Analysis of causes reveals that human flesh medicine died primarily from medical irrelevance rather than moral awakening, as European healthcare gradually developed treatments that were demonstrably more effective than consuming processed criminals. The abandonment of cannibalistic medicine wasn't driven by sudden recognition that eating human beings was ethically problematic. It was motivated by practical realization that corpse-based remedies were inferior to available alternatives for treating actual medical conditions. Internal problems that contributed to the decline included the persistent quality control issues that had plagued the flesh trade throughout its existence. Human body parts were inherently unreliable as pharmaceutical ingredients because their quality depended on variables like age, health, and cause of death that were difficult to standardize. Even the most sophisticated flesh merchants couldn't guarantee consistent product quality, creating customer dissatisfaction that encouraged experimentation with alternative treatments. The economic problems were equally devastating as international trade expanded European access to plant-based medicines that were cheaper to produce, easier to standardize, and more reliable in their effects than human flesh remedies. Apothecaries discovered they could generate better profits by importing common plants from distant regions and marketing them as exotic cures than by maintaining expensive infrastructure for processing human corpses that required complex supply chains and generated increasing social criticism. External pressures included growing international criticism of European cannibalistic practices that undermined claims to civilized superiority over other cultures. European merchants and diplomats operating in Asia and the Americas found that their association with systematic corpse consumption created diplomatic problems and commercial disadvantages in societies that viewed European flesh trading as evidence of primitive barbarism disguised as sophisticated medicine. The role of individuals versus historical forces demonstrates how medical transformation required both courageous individual physicians willing to challenge established practices and broader social changes that created receptive audiences for alternative approaches. Individual reformers provided intellectual leadership and clinical evidence, but their efforts would have been futile without concurrent developments in international trade, scientific education, and political modernization that made medical change possible and profitable. What could have been done differently represents a fascinating counterfactual question about whether human flesh medicine could have been reformed rather than abandoned entirely. Some contemporary observers argued that cannibalistic treatments could be made more ethical through better sourcing practices and quality control standards, while others maintained that any form of systematic human consumption was inherently problematic regardless of implementation details. The question of inevitability versus contingency reveals how the end of pharmaceutical cannibalism depended on specific historical circumstances that weren't necessarily predetermined. If European medical schools hadn't developed alternative educational approaches, if international trade hadn't provided access to effective plant medicines, if social attitudes hadn't shifted toward viewing cannibalism as primitive rather than sophisticated, human flesh medicine might have persisted for additional generations despite its obvious moral problems. Religious factors also contributed to the decline as Reformation movements created theological frameworks that were less tolerant of practices that could be interpreted as violating human dignity or divine commandments. While church authorities had previously provided justification for cannibalistic medicine, changing religious attitudes made it increasingly difficult to maintain theological support for systematic consumption of human flesh, regardless of claimed medical benefits. Perhaps most importantly, the analysis reveals how practices that seem permanently established can disappear relatively quickly when underlying social and economic conditions change. The death of human flesh medicine demonstrates that even institutions with centuries of tradition and professional support can become obsolete when they lose practical utility and social legitimacy. Though the elimination of specific practices doesn't necessarily address deeper structural problems that created demand for exploitation in the first place. The immediate aftermath of pharmaceutical cannibalism's collapse was characterized by institutional amnesia and historical revisionism, as European medical and religious authorities attempted to distance themselves from centuries of systematic corpse consumption while preserving their professional credibility and social status. Rather than acknowledging the moral implications of their participation in organized cannibalism, Most institutions treated the transition as natural evolution toward more sophisticated medical practices, who stepped into the vacuum left by declining. Flesh merchants included legitimate pharmaceutical entrepreneurs who had been developing plant and chemical-based alternatives, international traders who could supply exotic medicinal plants from distant regions, and innovative apothecaries who specialized in complex preparation methods that appeared scientific and sophisticated without requiring human ingredients. The short-term consequences included rapid expansion of botanical medicine markets as European customers transferred their demand for expensive, exotic treatments from human body parts to rare plants and synthetic compounds. This created new opportunities for medical fraud and exploitation that were less obviously offensive than cannibalism, but equally based on customer desperation and willingness to pay premium prices for treatments that provided psychological comfort rather than medical effectiveness. Contemporary reactions varied dramatically depending on participants' previous involvement in the flesh trade. Former customers generally avoided discussing their consumption of human flesh remedies, treating their cannibalistic medical history as embarrassing personal secret rather than shared social experience. Medical practitioners who had prescribed corpse-based treatments attempted to rebrand themselves as progressive physicians, who had always been skeptical of traditional practices. The most revealing reactions came from religious authorities who struggled to explain their previous theological support for practices they now discouraged without admitting that church-endorsed medicine had been systematically promoting sinful behavior. Some clergy developed complex theological explanations for why historical cannibalistic medicine had been acceptable under previous circumstances but was no longer appropriate given modern medical alternatives. Attempts at revival or continuation were largely unsuccessful as social stigma made open advocacy for human flesh medicine politically impossible even among traditionalists who remained convinced of its medical effectiveness. Some underground markets persisted for customers seeking authentic cannibalistic treatments, but these operated with such secrecy that they had minimal influence on broader medical practice. The immediate legacy ultimately demonstrated how thoroughly social practices could be erased from public memory when they became politically inconvenient, allowing European society to abandon systematic cannibalism while avoiding uncomfortable acknowledgement of the moral catastrophe that centuries of pharmaceutical corpse consumption represented for civilizations that claimed superior ethical and intellectual authority over supposedly primitive cultures that practiced less sophisticated forms of human exploitation. The legacy of pharmaceutical cannibalism shaped later medical developments in ways that European society preferred not to acknowledge, creating institutional frameworks and commercial practices that would influence healthcare long after the last ground-up criminal disappeared from pharmacy shelves. Rather than representing an isolated historical aberration, the flesh trade established precedents for treating desperate patients as profitable markets and using expert authority to legitimize practices that primarily benefited merchants and physicians rather than people seeking genuine medical care. Specific influences on later developments included the normalization of expensive, exotic treatments as markers of medical sophistication, creating consumer expectations that effective medicine should be costly and difficult to obtain. The psychological dynamics that had driven demand for premium human flesh remedies, the equation of price with quality, the appeal of rare ingredients, the social prestige of accessing cutting-edge treatments, continued operating in post-cannibalistic medical markets where customers sought similar status through consumption of expensive plant medicines and synthetic compounds. How later generations viewed the flesh trade reveals the power of institutional amnesia in preserving professional authority while eliminating inconvenient historical facts. European medical schools began teaching sanitized versions of pharmaceutical history, that mentioned human flesh medicine as brief historical curiosity rather than centuries-long mainstream practice, allowing modern physicians to maintain professional pride while avoiding uncomfortable questions about how medical authority had been used to justify systematic cannibalism. The myths versus realities that developed around cannibalistic medicine demonstrate how societies can rewrite their own history to preserve favorable self-images. Popular narratives began portraying the flesh trade as primitive superstition practiced by ignorant people, rather than sophisticated commercial enterprise supported by the most educated and respected institutions in European society. This revisionist history allowed modern Europeans to feel superior to their supposedly backward ancestors while ignoring the continuity between historical and contemporary forms of medical exploitation. Why the flesh trade remained important in some contexts while being forgotten in others relates to ongoing political needs for historical narratives that support current institutional authority. Medical schools needed histories that portrayed continuous progress towards scientific enlightenment rather than cycles of exploitation with different products and methods. Religious institutions required theological frameworks that emphasized moral advancement rather than persistent human capacity for systematic evil disguised as sophisticated expertise. The most significant long-term influence was the establishment of regulatory and educational systems designed to prevent obvious scandals like pharmaceutical cannibalism, while preserving the underlying commercial relationships that made such exploitation profitable. Rather than addressing fundamental problems with profit-driven healthcare, post-cannibalism reforms focused on eliminating practices that generated public criticism while maintaining institutional structures that continued prioritizing merchant interests over patient welfare. The legacy also included the development of more sophisticated methods for medical fraud that were harder to detect and criticize than obvious cannibalism. European entrepreneurs learned to avoid practices that generated obvious moral outrage, while maintaining commercial strategies that exploited customer desperation through expensive treatments that provided psychological comfort rather than medical effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the historical impact demonstrates how completely normal people can participate in obviously evil enterprises when those enterprises are presented as legitimate business opportunities supported by respected authorities. The flesh trade provides a case study in how institutional legitimacy can be used to justify systematic human exploitation, creating precedents for later forms of commercialized suffering that operate with similar psychological and economic dynamics. The persistence of these patterns reveals how cosmetic reforms can create appearances of progress while preserving fundamental problems, allowing societies to congratulate themselves for eliminating specific offensive practices, while continuing to operate systems that create ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation through different methods that appear more civilized but maintain similar exploitative relationships between authorities and vulnerable populations seeking help. Today, we can see echoes of pharmaceutical cannibalism in contemporary healthcare systems that prioritize profit over patient welfare, use expert authority to legitimize expensive treatments regardless of effectiveness, and treat desperate patients as markets for products that provide psychological comfort rather than genuine medical benefit. The specific parallels are uncomfortably obvious for anyone familiar with modern medical scandals involving unproven treatments, exploitative pricing, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. The most direct parallel exists in the contemporary market for expensive alternative medicines that promise miraculous results through exotic ingredients, complex preparation methods, and sophisticated marketing campaigns that appeal to the same psychological needs that drove demand for premium human flesh remedies. Modern customers who pay extraordinary prices for rare plant extracts imported mineral compounds, or synthesized chemical combinations, are participating in commercial relationships that differ more in style than substance from historical markets. For ground-up criminals, specific parallels include the persistent equation of price with quality that makes expensive treatments seem superior regardless of actual effectiveness, the appeal of exotic ingredients that appear more sophisticated than conventional alternatives, and the social prestige associated with accessing cutting-edge medical treatments that demonstrate wealth and sophistication. Contemporary patients who seek expensive concierge medicine or experimental treatments are satisfying similar psychological needs to historical customers who purchased premium human body part remedies. What hasn't changed about human nature includes the fundamental vulnerability to exploitation that makes desperate people willing to pay extraordinary prices for treatments that promise hope regardless of scientific evidence. The same psychological mechanisms that convinced Europeans to consume processed criminals still operate in modern contexts where patients make healthcare decisions based on marketing claims, expert authority, and social pressure rather than careful evaluation of evidence and alternatives. Similar patterns in different contexts reveal how medical exploitation adapts to changing social conditions while maintaining basic commercial dynamics that prioritize profit over patient welfare. Contemporary examples include pharmaceutical companies that charge extraordinary prices for essential medications, medical entrepreneurs who market unproven treatments to desperate patients, and healthcare systems that treat sick people as revenue opportunities rather than human beings deserving ethical care. The parallels extend to institutional structures that enable systematic exploitation through legitimate channels, where respected authorities provide endorsement for practices that primarily benefit commercial interests rather than patients seeking help. Modern medical schools, professional associations, and regulatory agencies sometimes function as legitimizing institutions for practices that are profitable for healthcare industries but harmful or ineffective for patients. Contemporary healthcare scandals involving systematic overtreatment, fraudulent research, and exploitative pricing demonstrate how easily medical authority can be used to justify practices that violate basic ethical principles, just as historical physicians prescribed human flesh remedies with professional confidence while participating in systematic cannibalism disguised as sophisticated healthcare. The lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of maintaining skepticism toward expensive treatments that promise extraordinary results, the need for independent evaluation of medical claims that are influenced by commercial interests, and the recognition that institutional authority doesn't guarantee ethical behavior or effective treatment. Most significantly, the parallels reveal how commercial healthcare systems create ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation that require constant vigilance and regulatory oversight to prevent new forms of systematic patient abuse. The same economic incentives that made pharmaceutical cannibalism profitable still operate in modern medical markets, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs willing to exploit customer desperation through expensive treatments that provide psychological benefits rather than genuine medical effectiveness. The historical perspective also illuminates how contemporary medical exploitation operates through legitimate institutions and respected authorities, making it difficult for patients to distinguish between genuine medical advancement and sophisticated fraud disguised as cutting-edge healthcare. Understanding how European society normalized systematic cannibalism provides insight into how modern societies might be normalizing other forms of medical exploitation that will seem obviously unethical to future generations. The modern connections ultimately demonstrate that the fundamental problems that enable pharmaceutical cannibalism, unregulated medical claims, profit-driven healthcare, and treatment of desperate patients as commercial opportunities persist in contemporary medical systems that have eliminated obvious practices like systematic corpse consumption, while preserving underlying commercial relationships that continue, creating vulnerabilities to exploitation through more sophisticated but equally harmful methods. Even now, the legacy of pharmaceutical cannibalism influences contemporary healthcare through institutional structures, commercial practices, and regulatory frameworks that were originally developed to manage the transition away from obvious cannibalism, while preserving the profitable aspects of medical exploitation. The influence operates largely below conscious awareness, embedded in assumptions about medical authority, commercial healthcare, and the relationship between expertise and ethical behavior. Academic study of pharmaceutical cannibalism remains limited and sanitized, with most medical historians treating the flesh trade as brief historical aberration rather than centuries-long mainstream practice that reveals fundamental problems with how European society organized healthcare around commercial interests. This academic amnesia prevents modern medical professionals from understanding how easily respected institutions can become vehicles for systematic exploitation when economic incentives align with human desperation. Popular culture occasionally references historical medical cannibalism as colorful historical curiosity, but these treatments typically focus on the exotic strangeness of consuming human flesh rather than the systematic institutional corruption that enabled widespread participation in obviously unethical practices. The entertainment value of cannibalistic medicine distracts from serious examination of how similar exploitation might operate in contemporary contexts. Political discourse sometimes invokes pharmaceutical cannibalism as example of primitive medical ignorance that demonstrates modern scientific superiority, but these comparisons avoid uncomfortable questions about continuity between historical and contemporary forms of medical exploitation. Politicians use sanitized versions of cannibalistic medicine to support arguments about medical progress while ignoring ongoing vulnerabilities to systematic patient abuse. Social movements occasionally reference the flesh trade when criticizing contemporary healthcare practices, but these references typically focus on obvious parallels, like expensive, exotic treatments, rather than deeper structural similarities in how commercial medical systems prioritize profit over patient welfare. The historical example provides rhetorical ammunition for healthcare critics without necessarily contributing to systematic understanding of how medical exploitation operates. Why people still care about pharmaceutical cannibalism relates primarily to its value as historical curiosity that allows modern audiences to feel superior to supposedly primitive ancestors while avoiding recognition of similar problems in contemporary contexts. The flesh trade provides psychologically comfortable distance that makes it easier to acknowledge systematic evil in historical contexts than to recognize ongoing exploitation in familiar institutions. The continuing influence ultimately demonstrates how historical amnesia serves current institutional interests by preventing serious examination of how respected authorities can systematically exploit vulnerable populations through legitimate channels. Understanding pharmaceutical cannibalism could provide valuable insights into contemporary medical problems, but this potential remains largely unrealized due to academic, political, and social incentives that favor sanitized historical narratives over uncomfortable truths about institutional corruption and human vulnerability to systematic exploitation disguised as sophisticated expertise. This forgotten chapter of pharmaceutical history matters because it reveals how easily civilized societies can normalize systematic evil when it's presented as sophisticated expertise supported by respected institutions. The flesh trade demonstrates that obvious moral violations can become socially acceptable through gradual institutional legitimization, expert endorsement, and commercial success, creating precedents for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary Context. Understanding how European society organized systematic cannibalism around medical authority provides insight into how modern healthcare systems might be perpetuating other forms of exploitation that seem normal to current participants, but will appear obviously unethical to future generations. The historical perspective illuminates blind spots in contemporary medical practice that might be difficult to recognize from within current institutional frameworks. The pharmaceutical cannibalism story also provides a case study in how institutional amnesia operates to protect current authority while erasing inconvenient historical facts. The systematic forgetting of widespread medical cannibalism demonstrates how societies can rewrite their own histories to preserve favorable self-images while avoiding uncomfortable questions about ongoing institutional corruption. Most importantly, this history matters because it challenges assumptions about medical progress, institutional reliability, and the relationship between expertise and ethical behavior that continue influencing how people evaluate contemporary healthcare claims and make decisions about medical treatment in contexts where commercial interests may conflict with patient welfare. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes of our exploration involves the last known transaction in the European pharmaceutical flesh trade, which occurred in 1751 in a small German apothecary run by Wilhelm Hofmann, an elderly pharmacist who had spent his entire career processing human remains into medicine for customers who refused to abandon traditional cannibalistic treatments. Hoffman's final customer was Maria Kleist, a wealthy widow whose family had been purchasing human flesh remedies for 3 generations and who believed that abandoning traditional medicine would dishonor her ancestors' memory. The transaction involved a carefully preserved portion of Egyptian mummy that Hoffmann had been saving for special occasions, combined with fresh skull powder from a recently executed highway robber, prepared according to recipes that had been passed down through his family for over a century. What makes this story so revealing is the casual normalcy of the interaction, preserved in Hoffmann's business records that were discovered in German archives in the 1960s. The widow arrived at the apothecary with her granddaughter, discussing the proper preparation of human flesh medicine as casually as modern families might discuss vitamin supplements. The granddaughter expressed polite interest in traditional preparation methods while privately planning to seek modern, plant-based treatments from progressive physicians in nearby cities. The significance of this final transaction extends beyond simple historical curiosity to reveal how gradually social practices can disappear without dramatic confrontation or official prohibition. Hoffmann closed his shop, not because authorities forced him to stop selling human flesh medicine, but because Maria Kleist died the following year, and no other customers remained who specifically requested cannibalistic treatments. The end of pharmaceutical cannibalism was more whimper than bang. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes becomes clear when you realize it demonstrates the 3-way collision between tradition, progress, and commercial interest that characterized the entire transformation of European medicine. Hoffmann represented institutional expertise built around obviously unethical practices. Maria Kleist embodied customer loyalty based on family tradition rather than objective evaluation. The granddaughter symbolized generational change driven by access to better alternatives rather than moral awakening. What the story reveals about everything we've discussed is how thoroughly social change can occur through quiet individual decisions rather than dramatic institutional reform. The flesh trade didn't end through government regulation, religious condemnation, or medical revolution. It ended through customer preferences, gradually shifting toward treatments that were more effective and less socially embarrassing than consuming processed criminals. How this connects to our broader exploration demonstrates the persistence of psychological and commercial dynamics that transcend specific historical practices. The same needs that drove Maria Kleiss to purchase ground-up criminals: desire for traditional authenticity, fear of abandoning proven remedies, social pressure to maintain family medical practices, continue operating in contemporary contexts, where people make healthcare decisions based on tradition, authority, and social expectations, rather than careful evaluation of evidence. The memorable final image from Hoffman's records shows him carefully wrapping the last portion of mummy powder in brown paper, writing detailed preparation instructions in his precise handwriting, and accepting payment from a customer who genuinely believed she was purchasing sophisticated medicine rather than participating in systematic cannibalism. The mundane nature of this final transaction reveals how completely European society had normalized practices that should have been recognized as obviously evil. This story connects to everything we've explored because it demonstrates how institutional corruption operates through normal human relationships rather than dramatic criminal conspiracies. How social change occurs through gradual shifts in customer preferences rather than revolutionary transformation, and how easily people can participate in systematic exploitation while maintaining their self-perception as responsible, caring individuals seeking the best possible outcomes for themselves and their families. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating and horrifying world of pharmaceutical cannibalism, it's worth reflecting on what this forgotten chapter of medical history teaches us about human nature, institutional authority, and the persistent challenge of distinguishing between genuine expertise and sophisticated fraud disguised as medical advancement. The story of European flesh trading reminds us that obvious moral violations can become socially acceptable through gradual institutional legitimization, that expensive treatments aren't necessarily effective treatments, and that respected authorities can systematically exploit vulnerable populations while maintaining their claims to ethical and intellectual superiority. These lessons remain relevant for anyone navigating contemporary medical systems, where commercial interests sometimes conflict with patient welfare. But perhaps the most important insight from our exploration is that understanding how past societies normalize systematic evil can help us recognize similar patterns in our own time, creating opportunities to address ongoing vulnerabilities to exploitation before they develop into the kind of comprehensive institutional corruption that characterized centuries of European pharmaceutical cannibalism. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's strangest and most troubling medical practices. Take care of yourselves. Think carefully about the treatments you accept. And remember that the most sophisticated sounding expertise isn't always the most trustworthy. As the sounds of the night settle around us and we prepare to close this particular chapter of human history, there's something oddly comforting about the fact that pharmaceutical cannibalism has become nothing more than a historical curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the long story of human medical experimentation that ended not through dramatic moral awakening, but through the quiet triumph of treatments that actually worked over those that merely appeared sophisticated. The European flesh trade ultimately failed, not because people suddenly recognized that eating criminals was ethically problematic, but because customers gradually discovered that plant medicines and chemical compounds were more effective, more reliable, and less socially awkward than consuming processed human remains. This practical triumph of effectiveness over tradition provides a gentle reminder that human societies do occasionally make progress, even if that progress is motivated more by convenience than moral enlightenment. There's also something deeply human about the way pharmaceutical cannibalism disappeared, not through legislative bans or religious condemnation, but through the accumulated decisions of individual customers who simply stopped buying products that seemed primitive compared to available alternatives. The end came through thousands of small choices by ordinary people who decided they preferred plant-based remedies to ground-up criminals, creating market forces that gradually eliminated systematic cannibalism without requiring anyone to acknowledge the full moral implications of previous practices. This gentle ending reflects the complex nature of social change, which often occurs through practical adaptations rather than dramatic moral revelations. European society didn't suddenly develop ethical sophistication that made cannibalistic medicine unacceptable. It gradually developed medical alternatives that made human flesh remedies seem obsolete. The transition was more about technological progress than moral advancement, though the practical result was the elimination of systematic evil disguised as sophisticated healthcare. The story also offers hope that other forms of institutional exploitation might disappear through similar processes of practical obsolescence, as people discover better alternatives to systems that prioritize commercial interests over human welfare. Just as European customers gradually abandoned flesh merchants in favor of plant medicine specialists, contemporary patients might gradually abandon healthcare systems that treat them as profit centers rather than human beings deserving ethical care. Perhaps most comforting is the recognition that the same human vulnerabilities that made pharmaceutical cannibalism possible, desperation for effective treatment, trust in expert authority, desire for social prestige through expensive medicine, can also drive demand for genuinely beneficial healthcare when better options become available. The psychological needs that created markets for human flesh remedies can redirect toward supporting medical systems that actually help people rather than exploiting their desperation. The fade into historical obscurity that has claimed pharmaceutical cannibalism suggests that even the most thoroughly normalized forms of systematic evil can become unthinkable when underlying conditions change. European society didn't require moral revolution to abandon centuries of medical cannibalism. It just needed access to treatments that were obviously superior to consuming dead criminals, combined with gradual recognition that sophisticated-sounding expertise isn't always trustworthy. This quiet triumph of practical wisdom over institutional authority provides a peaceful note on which to end our exploration of one of history's strangest medical practices. The European flesh trade serves as both warning about human capacity for systematic evil and reassurance about human capacity for quiet practical progress, reminding us that the most important changes often occur through accumulated individual choices rather than dramatic institutional reforms. Sleep well, knowing that your local pharmacy is stocked with remedies that don't require systematic grave robbing to maintain inventory, and that the worst excesses of European pharmaceutical history have faded into well-deserved obscurity through the simple process of people gradually choosing better alternatives when they became available.